This is part 4 of R.M. Stratton's The Trappist Incident Book 1 in his military science fiction series, Concord Horizon. If you enjoy the audiobook, the link to the ebook available on Amazon is in the description. 49. Realignment. Kemov chose the ground before the enemy could choose it for him. A shallow rise at the edge of the village, enough elevation to observe movement across the open ground, enough cover to survive what came back. One Marine to his left behind a low stone wall, the other to his right at a narrowing in the road where the terrain compressed movement into a predictable line. Hold. The Marines settled into position without acknowledgement. They did not need to give one. Across the open ground the advance began. Brown dwarfs, mixed units of human, Lenian, and Kalar, moving with the outward appearance of cohesion. Fire teams across multiple approach vectors, covering angles, pushing toward the village with the deliberateness of people who had done this kind of work before and expected to finish it. Kemov tracked spacing, timing, and the relationships between elements. "They are organized," the Marine on his left said. Yes, too organized in the way that revealed its own inconsistency under close observation. The spacing was correct. The movement patterns were almost correct. There was a slight mismatch in timing between units, not enough to suggest incompetence, enough to suggest something else he could not yet name. He filed it. Wait. The first element crossed into effective range. A Kalar-led unit pushing ahead of adjacent elements with an aggression that did not match the measured pace of the flanks, advancing without waiting for alignment. Kemov raised his rifle. Now! The first shot cracked across the open ground. The lead Kalar dropped. The Marines followed with controlled bursts, forcing the forward elements to check their momentum. Return fire came quickly, tight and directed, but its distribution was wrong, not unified. The responses came from the right places without being coordinated across them. Watch their flanks. The next wave advanced. Human and Lenian units moved forward, but not with the same urgency as the Kalar pushing ahead. Their pace was almost restrained, as though they were maintaining proximity without committing to the same objective. Then a shift, subtle, precise. A human soldier on the left flank stopped mid-step, turned, raised his weapon, and fired, not toward Kemov's position, into the Kalar unit advancing past him. A Lenian beside him followed a fraction of a second later, the two actions nearly simultaneous. No confusion, no hesitation. Deliberate, executed with the timing of something decided in advance. The Kalar line fractured not from incoming fire but from within. Contact inside their formation, the right Marine said. Kemov shook his head once. No. The pattern was too clean for confusion. More units pivoted, human and Lenian elements redirecting their fire with near simultaneous timing, cutting into Kalar positions with overlapping fields that left no obvious gap to retreat through. The coordination was tight enough to have been rehearsed, or at minimum agreed upon before the engagement began. Killer units that had been advancing with confidence found their flanks collapsing as the elements that should have been covering them turned against them instead. Some tried to return fire. Some pushed forward anyway. Most did not go far. Kemov adjusted his fire to exploit the fracture, targeting the Kalar elements still moving and letting the internal engagement handle the rest. One broke from cover, he fired once, and the figure dropped. Another turned mid-step and was hit from behind by a former ally before Kemov could acquire the angle. They are selecting targets. The human and Lenian elements were choosing Kalar specifically and leaving everything else. The left Marine exhaled. Looks that way. Kemov ran the logic forward without taking his eyes off the field. There was no real-time communication at interstellar distance. Whatever had just happened had not been ordered in the moment. No command structure could issue instructions through the void at the speed required, which meant the human and Lenian elements had deployed under embedded orders. Pre-arranged contingency triggers, established before the unit ever boarded the ship, with conditions specified in advance and recognition cues telling each operator when those conditions had been met. Engagement at this location. Kellar in command. Coalition forces present. Some configuration of those facts had crossed a threshold, and the contingency had executed. The structure was elegant in a way Kimov registered with professional respect. A multi-species mercenary unit, paid by a Kellar contractor, working alongside Kellar enforcers, but answering, through some other channel, to someone who had purchased the option of a different outcome under specific conditions. Whoever held that second contract had paid in advance and built the trigger into the deployment itself, because no other architecture could have functioned. Hunger is not your aunt. The proverb arrived unbidden. Hunger did not show mercy. Hunger did not negotiate, did not extend kindness because circumstances were difficult. Mercenaries were the same. They served whoever fed them, and when the choice came down to who paid better and who paid first, sentiment was not part of the calculation. Whoever had paid the Kellar to lead this operation had paid less, or paid later, than whoever had paid the human and Lenian elements to be ready for the moment when leading them mattered more than following them. The human and Lenian units moved now with a different kind of cohesion, not the loose coordination of a mercenary band following the same contract, but something tighter. The Kellar were isolated, outnumbered, and losing ground in multiple directions. Kimov did not assume alignment with his own position, did not assume shared intent. He observed behavior, and behavior told him one thing clearly: this force had not degraded under pressure. It had changed. The decision had been made considerably longer than 5 minutes ago, and had simply been waiting for its moment. Take what is given. He recalculated the engagement in light of the new reality. This alters the balance. In our favor? The right Marine asked, eyes still tracking movement below. Another Kellar unit attempted to regroup behind a low earthen berm, drawing fire from 2 directions before the attempt could complete itself. For now, this was not a rout. It was a controlled realignment, decided before the first shot was fired, executed when the conditions matched the trigger. He did not know yet whom the human and Lenian elements answered to in their second contract. He did not need to know. He needed to survive long enough for that question to become answerable. Maintain pressure. Do not assume they are on our side. The Marines acknowledged, and fire resumed, measured, deliberate, targeting only what was clearly still a threat. Across the field, the brown dwarfs had not broken. They had shifted, and Kimov intended to understand what that meant before it shifted again. 50. Line in the dirt. Everything hit at once. Varos to Hansen. Tight. Controlled. Go. 3 heel has landed. In the field. Of course he had. Before I could respond, Kimov's voice cut across. The brown dwarfs have shifted engagement. Human and Lenian elements are targeting Kellar units. I went still. Say again. They are engaging selectively. Kellar are the primary targets. Not chaos, not a breakdown under pressure. A decision had been made somewhere in that formation before the shooting started, implemented with enough coordination to confirm it had been planned rather than improvised. I let it settle for half a second and ran the logic forward. No real-time FTL communication existed. Whatever had just turned the human and Lenian elements against the Kellar had not been ordered in the moment. No command structure could issue instructions through the void at the speed required. which meant embedded orders. Prearranged triggers built into the deployment before the unit ever boarded the ship, with conditions specified in advance. Engagement here. KLR in command. Coalition forces present. Some configuration of those facts had crossed a threshold, and the contingency had executed. Someone had bought a second contract on top of Three Heel's first, paid in advance, built the trigger into the operational deployment. No other architecture could have functioned across interstellar distance. I did not need to know who yet. I needed to know the brown dwarfs were not on my side, even though they were currently shooting in a direction that was convenient for me. Understood? Maintain position. Don't assume alignment. Affirmative. The line dropped. Three Heel had brought a mercenary force, and that force had just redefined itself mid-engagement. Not good, not bad, unpredictable, which in an active firefight was its own category of problem and needed to be treated as one. I turned. Himura. She looked up immediately, still focused on the infant. The baby's crying had softened, still present but weaker, more settled, stable enough for what came next. I need a triage point, center of the village, keep it visible. Anyone wounded, ours, theirs, you treat them. No hesitation. I'll need space. Take it. I was already turning when she spoke. Be careful. I looked back at her for a moment, not the physician, not the officer, just her, already moving, already transitioning between patients with the efficiency of someone who had learned to hold multiple things without dropping any of them. I did not say what I was thinking. Be careful, Nara. Gunfire cracked closer than before. I moved fast through the village, people pulling back from open spaces, voices climbing above the baseline noise, fear converting itself into motion as the containment broke and the fight started bleeding into the settlement's edges. I cleared the last structure and hit open ground. The field was already in motion. Three Hills shuttle sat hard in the dirt with no attempt at concealment, just presence, blunt and deliberate, a statement of arrival. Beyond it, the engagement had fractured into something that was not one battle, but several, overlapping and shifting simultaneously. Brown dwarf units moving against each other, but not randomly. Human and Lenian elements working in tight coordination, KLR units isolated and falling under overlapping fire from what had been, 60 seconds ago, the same contracted force. Not confusion. Selection. Exactly what Kemov had reported and exactly what the contract architecture had been built to produce. I slowed at the field's edge and took in what was directly ahead. Varos. Standing between Three Heel and Joseph with the immovability of someone who had decided on a position and stopped reconsidering it. Three Heel stood a few meters away with the relaxed posture of someone for whom the fighting around him was simply background noise generated by other people's problems. Joseph was not moving. Frozen, his body apparently waiting for the rest of him to catch up with what was happening. Favai had hold of his hand, pulling steadily, her voice carrying the calm of someone who meant what they were saying. You need to move. You are not safe here. He did not respond, did not look at her. His eyes were locked on Three Heel with the fixed attention of someone who had not yet registered that looking away was an option. Gunfire snapped again. A KLR soldier broke from cover and was cut down by two converging bursts from former allies. No hesitation, no confusion. Executing, not reacting. Three Heel did not look at any of it. His focus stayed on Joseph with the steadiness of someone who had come for one specific thing and was not going to be redirected by everything else falling apart around it. I stepped into the open. Three Heel. His head turned slightly, just enough. Hansen. I stopped a few meters short of Varos, close enough to act, far enough to think. Your people are having a disagreement, I said, nodding toward the engagement behind him. He did not glance at it. They were never mine. That answered one thing and opened another. Confirmed, then. Someone had bought him out from under the contract, and Three-Heel knew it, and was choosing to operate as though it had not happened. I shifted my angle to put myself more directly between Three-Heel and Joseph. "Step away from the boy." Three-Heel's gaze moved past me to Joseph briefly, with the quality of someone checking on an asset rather than acknowledging a person. "He is not your concern." "That's exactly where you're wrong." Another burst of fire, closer. Dirt kicked up near the edge of the exposed object. Varus did not move. Three-Heel did not react. Joseph flinched, barely, just a small involuntary response, and Favai tightened her grip. "You must move," she said, quieter now, still not reaching him. Three-Heel took a step forward. Varus absorbed it without shifting his weight by a single degree, just stood there, a wall that had decided on its location and stopped being interested in arguments about it. Three-Heel regarded him the way you regard a calculation you have already decided to work around rather than through. "Your associate understands the geometry," he said. "You should as well. I understand it fine." Whether that was completely true was a question for later. I took another step. "Last chance." Three-Heel studied me with the patience of someone who had already decided on his next move and was waiting for the current one to conclude. Behind him, a Kalar unit tried to fall back and was cut off by crossfire from elements that had been covering their flank a minute ago. The battlefield kept shifting, finding new configurations, and at the center of it all, Joseph stood like gravity, everything orienting around him without his awareness or consent. I could feel it. Not physically, but in the way attention moved, in the way decisions were forming around a single fixed point. Three-Heel felt it too. That was why he was here, and why nothing else in the field mattered to him. I raised my weapon, not aimed yet, but visible and clear, a line drawn in the open rather than stated in words. Three-Heel tracked the movement. Varus did not react. Still aligned, at least on the basics. "Joseph." "Nothing. Look at me." Favai glanced at me, then back at him. "Joseph," she said, softer. That got something, a flicker, the fractional shift of attention that separated unreachable from almost reachable. "You need to move, right now." Behind him the object sat half-buried and quiet. Not the same quiet as before he had touched it. Something had changed in it, and everyone in that field could feel it, even if none of us could explain exactly what we were sensing, or why. Three-Heel saw the shift in Joseph's attention. Of course he did. I tightened my grip. Whatever came next was not going to be clean or without cost. That had stopped being a possibility the moment Three-Heel's shuttle touched down. "Move, Joseph." Because if he did not, someone else was going to make that decision for him, and someone else standing across that field was not going to make it in his favor. 51 rendezvous. Lieutenant Amanda Bishop still had not touched the captain's chair. She did not need it. Her hands rested on the helm controls, joystick in her right, throttle in her left, the glass cockpit alive with orbital tracks, velocity vectors, and projected intercept paths in thin, precise lines. This was where she belonged. Not behind, not observing. Flying. The captain's chair sat empty behind her, exactly where it had been since the crew went planetside. She was aware of it in the peripheral way you are aware of things that are present and not in use, like an argument that has not been started yet. Hernandez had offered her the chair before leaving. Bishop had acknowledged the offer and returned her attention to the helm, which was the only answer the situation required. "All right," she murmured, eyes moving across the tactical overlay with the focused economy of someone who had been doing this long enough that reading a sensor display felt less like processing data and more like listening. "Let's change things up." The far side of Eden concealed the Fang from direct line of sight. not from physics. Nothing hid from physics. Not ships, not intentions, not the consequences of decisions made 3 moves ago that were only now producing their results. The enemy ship held a higher orbit, steady and deliberate, positioned above the operational theater with the quiet confidence of something that believed it owned the high ground and had built its entire ground plan around that belief. That was the problem. And possibly, if the math cooperated, if the window was as clean as she thought it was, if she did not miscalculate any of the variables she was holding in working memory simultaneously, the opportunity. "If we get lucky," she said quietly to no one in particular, "we cut off his orbital support before he knows we're here." Behind her, the 2 ensigns maintained their silence. She had registered their presence when they took their stations and had largely stopped thinking about them since. They were competent, they were staying out of her way, and the bridge felt appropriately small given the size of what she was about to attempt. She did not have time to manage people right now. She needed all of it for the problem. She leaned forward and pulled up the full orbital profile, running her eyes across the numbers with the focused attention of someone reading a language they had spoken long enough. The translation was no longer a conscious step. Velocity differentials between the 2 ships, orbital inclination of the Fang relative to the planet's equatorial plane, phase angles, the angular relationship between their current position and the Fang's, which told her how far ahead in orbit the enemy ship sat, and therefore how much she needed to close before the window expired. The math was not abstract to her. It had never been. At the academy, orbital mechanics had been the subject that filtered cadets. Either you felt it in a way that made the equations feel like descriptions of something real, or you processed it purely as computation and always stayed one step behind the problem. Bishop had been the former since her 2nd week in the program. Numbers told her where things were going before they got there, and she trusted that more than she trusted most people. The decision was made before she finished reviewing the last column. "We're dropping to a lower orbit, setting up an intercept." The engineering ensign hesitated, which she had anticipated. "Ma'am, that'll make us faster, yes." She was already entering the burn parameters. Lower orbit meant higher orbital velocity. Kepler's 3rd law, the same physics that governed every satellite humanity had ever put around every world it had ever circled. Closer to the planet, faster around it, which meant she could close the phase angle, catch the Fang from behind instead of chasing it on a parallel track they would never close in time. It also means commitment. Once we make this burn, correcting for error costs fuel and time we don't have. So we don't make errors. She looked at the burn solution. Execute. Singapore responded with the crisp immediacy she had come to expect from the children-enhanced systems. A controlled burn. Clean and precise, the ship dropping into a tighter orbital path without drama. Bishop felt the shift through her hands on the throttle, the subtle change in feedback as the ship's geometry relative to the planet adjusted. Not a physical sensation exactly. More like the difference in how a room sounds when a window opens. Something in the relationship had changed, and her hands knew it before the numbers confirmed it. She brought up the Fang's projected track and studied the phase relationship with the updated parameters. Still ahead, still holding the higher orbit, still unaware. But the gap was different now, moving in a direction that had an endpoint. They're ahead of us in phase. We can't close it on this trajectory, not at this velocity differential. She was already working through the next step. We need to change the shape of the orbit itself. The science ensign leaned slightly forward. What's the play? Lower apogee. Tighten the arc. Cut inside their path instead of trying to match it. Her fingers moved across the controls with the precision of someone who had run this calculation in simulators enough times that the inputs arrived before the conscious thought that produced them. If we reduce the high point of our orbit while maintaining the low point, we shorten the total orbital path, which means we make the complete circuit faster. We gain on them without needing to accelerate. The ensign worked through it. That puts us, night side, below them, behind them, in the shadow of the planet where their passive sensors have the most interference and the least reason to be looking. She waited as the solution finalized across the display. The window appeared, narrow and specific, with the unforgiving precision orbital mechanics always offered. Exactly the margin the math said was available, not 1 meter more. She allowed herself the briefest acknowledgement of it. Got you. She committed the maneuver. A second burn, shorter than the first, angled 2 degrees off their current vector to reshape the trajectory without bleeding the velocity advantage she had built. Singapore bent into the new path with the responsiveness that still impressed her even after months aboard. The children engineering making adjustments older ship systems would have rounded to the nearest approximation. Below them, Eden's sunlit hemisphere swept past the terminator line and gave way to the dark hemisphere, the shadow side of the planet, the side that received no direct light and therefore offered no light to reflect. Exactly where she needed to be. Ahead, the Fang maintained its higher orbit with the unhurried steadiness of a ship that had no reason to believe it was being stalked. No course correction, no sensor sweep intensification, no indication whatsoever that the engagement had just changed around it without its knowledge. They had not seen it. Not yet. Bishop intended to maintain that condition for exactly as long as she needed, and not 1 second longer. She leaned back a fraction, not relaxing, just releasing some of the forward lean she had been holding since the burn, redistributing the tension without letting go of it entirely. Her hands stayed where they were. A thought surfaced, the kind that arrived uninvited when a specific kind of problem was being solved. Buzz Aldrin, doctoral thesis at MIT, 1963, line-of-sight guidance techniques for manned orbital rendezvous. The foundational work on how 2 spacecraft in different orbits could maneuver to meet, the geometric analysis of approach angles and closure rates, and the specific challenge of matching velocities with a target itself in motion relative to everything else. Written for navigating the Earth-Moon system. Designed for a world where the targets were human, the objectives were docking, and the worst-case scenario was mission abort rather than combat. Bishop glanced at her display. An alien warship. A contested independent world with active ground engagement. Multiple species involved in a conflict that had started with a buried object on a construction site in a different star system entirely. Bet you didn't see this one coming, she said. To Aldrin, to the orbital mechanics he had spent his career understanding, or to no one at all. The numbers updated steadily as the situation developed correctly. Distance closing, relative velocity shifting further in their favor. The phase angle shrinking by degrees that were small individually but collectively decisive. Physics did not accelerate for dramatic effect, did not slow down to allow for preparation. It just moved, the way it always moved, with the complete indifference of a universe that did not distinguish between favorable outcomes and unfavorable ones. Keep us dark, no active emissions of any kind. Passive only. Yes, ma'am, both ensigns replied in the slightly overlapping way that happened when 2 people were both paying close enough attention to respond simultaneously. The planet's shadow completed its work, swallowing them fully as they moved deep into the night side. The cockpit darkened as Eden's reflected light dropped away, and the only illumination came from the instrument panels and the distant, in different stars. Bishop barely noticed. The display told her everything she needed, and it was still lit. She checked the weapons status. Forward railguns at ready. Charge cycling, alignment confirmed. Targeting solution updating against the Fang's projected position in real time. Singapore's railguns were the ship's primary offensive system. Kinetic rounds at extremely high velocity, no light signature on launch, nothing visible in vacuum until the moment of impact. The Fang's passive sensors were looking for emissions, for drive signatures, for the electromagnetic indicators any active system produced. She was giving them nothing to find. Her grip tightened on the throttle by 1 degree. "We've got one shot at this." The words came out flat and calm, which was accurate to how she felt about it. Not fearless, she was aware of everything that could go wrong, had been cataloging it since she initiated the first burn. Just settled. The way she got when the problem was defined and the work was in progress. Panic would cost more than it was worth. Fire too early and we announce ourselves before we're in position. Fire too late and we've given Trihil time to use the Fang's weapons on the ground operation. She paused. So we fire at the right moment. No one responded. The ensigns understood without elaboration what the window meant in both directions. Miss it, and they would burn past the Fang, lose their positional advantage, hand back the high ground they had spent the last 20 minutes maneuvering to take, hit it, and the terms of the entire engagement changed. Everything happening on the surface below them hinged on what she did with the next 3 minutes of orbital mechanics. Singapore moved through the night side the way it moved best under her hands. Silent, controlled. No signature distinguishable from background radiation by anything the Fang was passively monitoring. The planet turned below them. The distance ahead closed in the patient arithmetic of orbital physics, each increment small and each one bringing the intercept point closer with the reliability of a calculation that had been run correctly from the beginning. The Fang held its track, still unaware. Still occupying the high ground like it was permanent. Nothing was permanent. Bishop's eyes fixed on the intercept point projected across the forward glass, the location in space where their adjusted trajectory would deliver them into optimal weapons range before the Fang's sensors could acquire them and before its crew could respond to the acquisition. The window was narrow, and she had no intention of reaching either edge of it. Easy? To the ship, to herself, to the orbital mechanics that governed everything in this theater with complete indifference to anyone's preferences. Easy meant measured. Easy meant precise. Easy meant the hands staying exactly where they were, and the inputs being exactly as large as needed, not 1 degree larger. The math was about to stop being numbers on a display. In a few minutes it would be a consequence. She was ready for it. 52, what we protect. The situation room was dim but alive. Screens layered across the walls, helmet feeds, drone relays, thermal imaging, orbital overlays, each one carrying a piece of the same story, none of them complete on its own. Gibby stood near the center console with his arms loosely folded, eyes moving from display to display. He was not tracking individuals anymore. He was watching patterns. Beside him, E stood still with her attention fixed on the same data, but her focus worked differently. Where Gibby looked for intent, she looked for meaning. "The pattern is changed," E said quietly. "Yeah." On the main display, the battlefield had shifted. Brown dwarf units still moved across the terrain, but no longer as one force. Human and Lenian elements had realigned, their fire converging on Keller positions with deliberate precision. Not disorder, not confusion, something decided. They are no longer unified. No, they're not. She watched as a Kellar unit pushed forward and was cut down from 2 directions by what had been its allies moments before. That is unusual. Gibby let out a slow breath. Yeah. She turned her head slightly toward him. Why would they turn on one another? They accepted the same contract. Contracts only go so far, especially when somebody decides the job got bigger than what they signed up for. E considered that. You believe this was anticipated? Feels like it. Brown dwarfs don't lose cohesion like that unless something was already in motion before the shooting started. He looked back at the feed. Somebody planned this, just not sure who yet, or what they wanted out of it. E turned back to the screens, watching human and Lennian units move with renewed coordination, isolating Kellar elements methodically. They are choosing. Gibby gave a small nod. That's a good way to put it. A new feed flickered into focus and stabilized. Helmet cam, Claudia Hernandez, moving quickly through broken terrain with two smaller figures close behind her. David and Sarah. They made it, Gibby said under his breath. E watched closely. The girl lagged slightly, just enough, just long enough, movement ahead. A Kalar soldier broke from cover with his weapon already rising. No hesitation in the motion, no warning. Pure intent. He has selected the child. E's voice dropped. Gibby's jaw tightened. Yeah. The moment compressed. Hernandez moved, stepping directly into the line of fire without pause, without visible calculation. Just instinct translated immediately into action. The shot came, missed by a margin too close to calculate comfortably. The Marine behind her fired, rounds striking the Kalar's torso, not clean, not immediately decisive, but enough to disrupt the follow-through. Enough to buy a moment. Hernandez used it. She drove forward, pushing Sarah hard toward cover and pulling David with her in the same motion. The Kalar staggered, trying to recover and finish what he had started. Hernandez turned back. One shot. Precise. The Kalar went down. The feed steadied, heavy breathing, controlled movement. The children were behind cover. Alive. E watched the sequence for several seconds without speaking. Why? She asked finally. Gibby did not answer immediately. He watched the replay once, just long enough to confirm what he had already seen, then leaned back slightly. Because she had to. E turned toward him. The child is not hers. Doesn't matter. He nodded toward the screen. You see a kid about to get killed, you don't stop and think about who she is. E studied him with the careful attention she brought to things that did not fit her existing framework. She placed herself in direct danger, knowingly. That increases the probability of her own death significantly. Also true. In my experience, most species do not behave that way. Gibby let out a small breath. Yeah, we get that a lot. She looked back at the display, at Hernandez already checking the children, already shifting back to mission focus as though what she had just done was unremarkable. Standard. Then why do you? E asked. Gibby thought about it for a moment. Not performing consideration, actually working through it. Because that's the job. To protect your own. He shook his head. To protect people. A pause. He nodded once toward the image of Sarah, still pressed against the cover Hernandez had driven her toward. Especially when it's a kid. Something shifted in E's posture, not visible in any single feature, but present in the quality of her stillness. A movement from observation toward something that looked more like reflection. That priority overrides personal survival. Sometimes. He looked back at the screens, the shifting alliances, the unpredictable decisions playing out across the surface in real time, none of it following the logic a contracted force was supposed to follow. And sometimes that's exactly the point. E did not respond immediately. She turned back to the displays and kept watching. The battle, the choices embedded in it, the moments where calculation gave way to something that did not fit neatly into any model she had built for predicting behavior. She was still observing. That had not changed. But for the first time since boarding Singapore, she was not entirely certain she could predict what she was going to see next. 53 terms. The field had gone quiet in all the wrong ways. Not silent, gunfire still cracked at the edges. Movement still flickered in the periphery. But right here, in the space between us, everything had compressed down to a few meters of ground and the people standing on it. Three-heel, Varos, Fevai, Joseph, and me. Joseph had not moved much since I had arrived. Still caught somewhere between stepping forward and stepping back, like his body had not settled on which direction meant survival. Eyes fixed, breathing shallow, the kind of stillness that was not control. Shock. He was 13 years old. He had just touched something that responded to his blood, and now he was standing in a field with the former Concord warden looking at him like he was a piece of strategic real estate, while gunfire broke apart 60 meters in every direction. Of course he was in shock. The wrong question was why. The right question was how to get him out of the line of fire without expecting decisions from him that he was not currently capable of making. Fevai still had hold of his hand, not forcing anything, just anchoring him. Varos stood exactly where he needed to be, in the space between Joseph and everything that wanted to reach him, and had not moved from it. Three-heel had not taken another step forward. He did not need to. He carried himself like someone who had already worked out the outcome and was waiting for the rest of us to catch up to it. Then I heard it. A shift in the air behind me, movement approaching without urgency. I did not turn fully, just enough to catch it in peripheral vision. Volksen stepping into the field. Another variable. Whether that was good or bad was not something I had time to determine yet, so I filed it and kept my attention where it belonged. Three-heel's eyes moved past me for half a second, registering the arrival, calculating what it meant, then returned to Joseph. Of course they did. This has progressed predictably, Three-heel said. Doesn't feel that way from here. He ignored that. His gaze shifted briefly to the object half buried in the dirt behind Joseph, then back. You are attempting to control a situation you don't fully understand. Story of my life. That got the faintest shift in his expression, not amusement, recognition. Then you will have to choose. I did not respond right away. You cannot secure both, he continued. The boy or the object, one or the other. There it was, simple, clean, and wrong in a way I could not explain to him yet without giving away more than I wanted to. I exhaled slowly and let my eyes drift past him for just a moment, upward, toward the sky. I could not read through the daylight haze, night side behind him. Orbit still turning. Timing still moving whether or not anyone down here was tracking it. I looked back at him. You're assuming you still control the high ground. Three-heel did not react, which meant I had his full attention. You came in loud. Dropped planet-side, committed forces, spread them across multiple vectors. A burst of gunfire cracked off to the right, closer than the last. Neither of us looked. You've been spacefaring long enough that you start to forget something. His eyes narrowed slightly. Limitations. No real-time comms at FTL. No relay satellites over this rock, which means right now, I gestured briefly toward the sky. You're out of contact with your ship. Whatever's happening up there, you won't know about it until someone burns Atmo to tell you. Silence. Just a beat of it, which was more than I expected. That condition is temporary, Three-heel said. Sure, everything is. But if I know my pilot, and I do, she's already figured out the window you left her. Varos did not move. Fevai did not speak. Joseph shifted slightly, just enough to tell me he was tracking the conversation now rather than fully frozen, the kind of small registration that suggested the shock was beginning to give way at the edges. You committed to the surface. You overextended, and now you're blind for just long enough. I let it trail. Three-Heel finished it. For your forces to exploit the window. Not my forces. Another burst of fire. Closer. A Kalar body hit the ground off to the side, dropped by crossfire from what had been its own support line 60 seconds ago. Three-Heel did not look, but he heard it. We all did. Your mercenary force isn't cohesive anymore, and you know it. That landed. Not visibly. Nothing in his expression shifted in any way that would read as weakness, but I could see him recalibrating, processing new inputs against a plan that had been built on different assumptions. Good. That meant I was not talking to someone who would dismiss the information. I took another step forward. This isn't your board the way you designed it. Three-Heel studied me with the patience he brought to everything. Then a faint exhale, not frustration, adjustment. You are making assumptions. Yeah, that's kind of what we do. I kept my stance angled to stay between him and Joseph without making the positioning obvious. You want the boy and the object, and you don't think you can take both without losing more than you plan to spend. That is correct. At least he did not waste time on misdirection. Here's where we differ. You think I have to choose between them. I shook my head once. I don't. His gaze hardened by a degree. I gave it to him straight. My turn. One last chance. Surrender yourself to my custody. Right now. The words sat in the air between us. Not shouted, not theatrical. Just stated. The way things get stated when you mean them and want the other person to understand that you mean them. Behind me, I could feel Favai moving, guiding Joseph slowly and carefully away from the center of the field, pulling him toward the edge with the steadiness she brought to everything that required precision over speed. This time he moved. Not fast, not cleanly, but he moved. Not a decision, more the body following someone who had been holding the hand long enough to be trusted to lead it. Good enough for now. Three-Heel saw it. Of course he did. He saw everything that mattered. But seeing it and being able to stop it were no longer the same thing, and I could see the moment he understood that. Everything was in motion now. The field, the situation, the board he had designed. And for the first time since his shuttle touched down, he was not the only one deciding how it ended. 54. Window. Night swallowed everything. The curve of Eden cut the stars into a hard line of shadow, and within that darkness Singapore moved without a trace. No emissions, no drive flare, no electromagnetic signature any passive sensor array would distinguish from the background noise of space. Bishop had been maintaining a stealth profile since they broke from geosynchronous orbit, and the discipline in every input she made was precise. Ahead, the Fang held its higher orbital track with the steady confidence of a ship that had not been told yet that the game had changed around it. Still unaware. Still operating on the assumption that the most significant threats to its position were on the ground below it, where its crew and its contracted forces were executing against a target that had no meaningful orbital component. That assumption was about to become expensive. Lieutenant Amanda Bishop leaned forward in the helm seat, not dramatically, just the natural lean of someone who had narrowed the world down to the contents of the forward display and was keeping every variable in active working memory simultaneously. Joystick steady in her right hand, throttle feathered in her left, the glass cockpit alive with the information she needed, and nothing that would distract from it. Orbital tracks in thin-colored lines. Velocity vectors. The intercept projection updating in real time as the relative positions of the two ships continued their slow, inexorable convergence. Distance. Velocity. Closure rate. She studied the numbers, and something in her stomach tightened. Not the closure rate that was in line with the approach she had planned. The angle. It had drifted. Not by much, not by anything that would have registered as an error in a standard navigation assessment, but she was not doing standard navigation. She was threading a window that required a precise approach geometry, and the angle was wrong. Too steep. Too far forward of the fang's position, rather than sliding in behind it the way the maneuver required. She ran it again in her head, instinct overlaying the mathematics the way it always did after enough hours in a cockpit. The numbers were one language, and the felt sense of where the ship was in three-dimensional space was another. And when both said the same thing, you trusted it. And when they disagreed, you figured out which one was right before you committed to anything. They disagreed. If she held the current approach angle, they would not slip in behind the fang. They would cross in front of it. Expose Singapore's forward profile to whatever passive sensors the fang was running, announce their presence in the worst possible way, and surrender, in a single moment, every advantage the last 20 minutes of careful, precise orbital maneuvering had been building toward. Her grip on the throttle tightened by a fraction. "Hold," she said quietly to herself or to the ship, or to the orbital mechanics that were currently not doing what she needed them to do. She held the approach without correction and watched the numbers. Orbital mechanics were patient in a way that nothing else was patient. Physics did not react to urgency. It did not accelerate its timeline because you needed it to, did not slow down because you needed more time to think. It just continued, steadily and without reference to what anyone wanted, following the equations that governed it with perfect fidelity. The intercept arc was shifting, barely, incrementally, by margins that would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching for them, but it was shifting. The angle was correcting itself as the fangs and Singapore's tracks continued their relative motion, and the distance between them changed by fractions of degrees per minute. The numbers updated. The angle was still wrong, but less wrong than it had been 30 seconds ago. Bishop exhaled very slowly through her nose. "Thank you, Sir Isaac Newton." Physics held. The window was still there, small, tight, with the unforgiving precision of something that would exist for exactly the period it existed, and not a second longer. She watched the approach continue its correction, the intercept point shifting incrementally toward the position she needed, and she held the controls steady and let it complete. Behind her, the engineering ensign broke the silence in the careful way someone does when they have information to deliver, but are trying not to disrupt the person who needs it most. "Ma'am, we're closing fast." "I know." She kept her eyes on the display. Looking back would cost her nothing and contribute nothing. "We're also still in the window, barely, but in it. The timing on the fire solution? If we fire too early, we light ourselves up before we're in position." Flat and instructional, not dismissive. The ensign needed to understand the constraints to be useful in this cockpit right now. The fang's passive sensors will acquire us the moment we generate any active emission. They turn, they burn, they bring weapons to bear, and we've spent 20 minutes of careful work for a bad engagement at the worst possible moment. A beat. If we fire too late, we've burned past the window. We're forward of their position, they've seen us, and we don't get another pass with this geometry. One shot at this approach. The ensign was quiet. That was the correct response. "Stand by weapons." Her voice stayed at the register it had been when she had made the decision, and the only remaining task was execution. Singapore's forward railguns came online. The cycling hum of the charging sequence was something she felt more than heard, transmitted through the ship's frame to her hands on the controls. Alignment confirmed. Targeting solution locked on the fang's projected position at the intercept point, updating as the real-time position data fed through the passive suite. Railguns. Kinetic rounds at extremely high velocity. No energy signature on launch. No visible discharge in vacuum, nothing to betray their position until the moment of impact. The ideal weapon for an approach that depended on not being seen until it was too late for seeing to be useful. The distance collapsed. Numbers in the upper right corner of her display ticking down in the steady, patient arithmetic of physics being physics. The fang grew in the forward display, dark against darker, massive, its angular Kellar silhouette barely distinguishable from the void except by the slight dimming of the stars it occluded. Still no course correction. Still no active sensor sweep in their direction. The Fang's crew was watching the ground operation. They were watching their contracted forces, their commander, and whatever was developing in that field. They were not watching the night side of the planet's orbital space for a stealth profile prototype frigate running dark. They were about to start. Bishop's eyes narrowed to the targeting solution. The numbers resolved toward alignment, the configuration of velocities, positions, and angles that meant the shot would go where she needed it to go. She watched it tighten, watched the last fractions of correction complete themselves. There, perfect alignment, opening and beginning to close, the window existing for exactly as long as the math said it would exist. Now, she fired. The railguns discharged in rapid sequence, not a single shot but a controlled burst, round spaced in the pattern she had calculated to distribute impact across the Fang's drive section. Kinetic rounds in vacuum moved without any visible indication of their passage. No light, no sound, no trail. Pure velocity, the simplest and most honest form of violence, mass moving fast, delivering all of its energy to whatever stopped it. She knew the hit before the sensors confirmed it. Knew it the way you knew things when your hands were in the system, and the system responded the way it did when something had changed. Hit, not loud, certain. The Fang's reaction was immediate and visible. Thrusters firing along the hull in the pattern of a ship trying to yaw, to turn, to bring its weapons to bear on whatever had just struck it, to convert from target to combatant. The response was fast, professional, and completely correct, given what had just happened to it. It just was not fast enough, because Bishop was already moving. She adjusted thrust and matched the Fang's turn, keeping Singapore positioned behind and below the arc, denying the angle the Fang needed to bring its weapons to bear on a target it still had not acquired visually, staying inside the turn and on the weapons solution. "Stay with it," she said, more to herself and to the ship than to anyone else on the bridge. The engineering ensign's voice came through tight. "We're pushing the relay systems hard. If we maintain this output for..." They'll hold, not hope, not reassurance. The flat certainty of someone who knew her ship and had made a decision. She's a good ship, and Varos maintains those systems to tolerances that exceed spec. They'll hold. Singapore responded the way it responded when she asked it for things, with the integrated precision of a vessel whose Lennian drive systems and Choldron computing architecture had been maintained by the two people in the galaxy most qualified to maintain them. Not a coalition standard ship. Something better. Something built to do things coalition standard ships could not do, by people from 3 species who had each brought their best to the same hull. She drove it harder. Fine adjustments, constant corrections, reading the Fang's response and staying one movement ahead of it, the way you stayed ahead of any opponent when you had chosen your position before they knew you were there. The Fang tried to complete its turn, slowing, losing the controlled quality of its initial response. The drive section that had taken the first rounds was doing what drive sections did when they took kinetic impacts. It was less capable than it had been 30 seconds ago, and the difference was showing in the Fang's movement. Mass mattered in orbital maneuvering. The Fang was considerably more massive than Singapore. In a direct engagement at equivalent readiness, that mass was an advantage, more shielding, more weapons, more structural integrity. At this moment it was working against them. Heavier ships changed direction more slowly. They required more energy to alter their orbital parameters, and their drive section had just been hit by kinetic rounds designed to reduce exactly that capability. Bishop fired again. 3 rounds placed where the previous shots had already compromised the Fang's structural integrity. Then 2 more, targeting the secondary drive array on the Fang's starboard side. Then a final burst, 5 rounds, distributed, as the Fang's response time degraded and the targeting solution opened up. 8 impacts total. Each one landed where she had calculated it needed to land. The Fang's motion changed quality. Velocity bleeding in the direction that meant one thing in orbital mechanics: insufficient energy to maintain the orbital altitude it had been holding. The arc was shifting, trajectory bending toward the planet rather than around it. "I'm reading velocity loss." The science ensign's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone reporting something significant while trying not to get in the way. "Their drive output is down, significantly down. They're losing altitude." Bishop had already seen it. She kept Singapore positioned above and behind, matching trajectory, staying in the dominant position while the Fang's options continued to narrow. She checked the orbital solution one more time and confirmed what the numbers had been telling her for the last 30 seconds. No recovery vector. No combination of available thrust and remaining drive capability produced a stable orbit. The Fang was going where the math said it was going, regardless of what anyone aboard it wanted. Suborbital. Committed. Singapore crossed the terminator line, and morning light exploded across the fore display. Eden's day side, the coastal terrain of the western settlements visible in sudden vivid detail from this altitude. The green of the interior and the gray-brown of the cliff tops, and beyond them the sea. Everything compressed into the clarity of a low orbital pass in daylight. Bishop held her position, held the controls, held the targeting solution in case the Fang somehow found thrust she had not accounted for. It did not. Only then, in the slow seconds after the last round, and the confirmation that the trajectory was what it was, did she become aware of her hands. The cramping had built gradually, the kind that accumulated over sustained fine motor control maintained past its natural duration. She flexed her fingers one hand at a time, keeping contact with the controls, letting the muscles release and reload. The thin sheen of sweat along her brow she addressed with the back of her wrist. Quick, efficient, no eyes off the display. She did not need to look away. There was nothing she needed to see that was not in front of her. The Fang was falling, not catastrophically, not in the uncontrolled spiral of a ship that had lost everything, but in the inevitable committed way of an object that had run out of the energy required to remain where it was. Controlled enough to make decisions about where it went. Not controlled enough to go anywhere it wanted. Eden was going to receive it. Bishop watched the trajectory plot update and settled into the steady, focused calm of someone whose job for the next several minutes was to watch a thing she had already done continue to produce its results. The hard part was finished. Now they watched it fall. 55, high ground. The field held, barely. Gunfire still echoed at the edges, controlled bursts, not chaos, the sound of a firefight that had found its shape. But right here, in the compressed space at the center of everything, the situation had narrowed back down to the same fixed pieces. Three-heel, Varos, Favai, Joseph, Frolkson, and me. Everything else was peripheral. Joseph was moving now, slow and unsteady, not the deliberate forward motion of someone who had made a decision so much as the reluctant drift of someone being gently redirected by someone they trusted. Fevai kept a light hold on his arm, guiding him away from the center of the field without making the movement obvious, just shifting him one careful step at a time, out of the direct line between Three-Heel and the object. Keep going. Don't stop. Three-Heel saw it. Of course he did. Three-Heel saw everything that mattered in a given field of observation, catalogued it, and assigned it a value in whatever calculation he was running. But he did not move to intercept, which meant he was still working through the variables, still looking for the angle that justified the action. That was my opening, and I knew it would not stay open long. Then, Bishop to Hansen. I did not take my eyes off Three-Heel. Go. Her voice came through clean, no static, no urgency bleeding into the edges of her words the way it did with pilots who were scared. Bishop sounded the way she always sounded when she was doing something extremely difficult, and doing it correctly. We've engaged the Fang. Sublight drive is compromised. It's lost orbital stability. The words landed before I'd finished processing them. Say again. Suborbital now. Trajectory projects uncontrolled descent. Impact point is not far from your position. You've got maybe 2 minutes from right now. I glanced upward instinctively, even though there was nothing to see yet. The sky above Eden was still clear and blue and completely indifferent to what was about to fall through it. 2 minutes. I had run 2-minute offenses before. The principle was the same. You do not have time for anything that is not the next essential thing. Copy. Good work, Bishop. Still tracking. Don't waste it. Understood. The line cut. I looked back at Three-Heel. Something had shifted in him. Not dramatically visible, not the kind of change an observer without context would have caught, but I'd been watching him closely enough across enough of this operation to read the difference. The smallest recalibration. The quality of stillness that settled over a person when a plan built on a specific set of assumptions encountered information that undermined one of those assumptions. His ship was suborbital. His orbital support was gone. The high ground he had been counting on to provide options if the ground operation went wrong had just been removed from the equation by a pilot he had never met making a decision she had seconds to commit to. I let him have a moment with that. Let it settle where it needed to settle. You've lost your high ground. Silence. He did not deny it, did not argue, did not offer a counterframing, which told me everything I needed to know about how precisely he had already run the same calculation I had. Three-Heel did not waste energy contesting facts. I took a step forward, keeping my voice even. You don't have a ship in a position to use. You don't have a cohesive force on the ground. As if on cue, a Kellar body hit the dirt 20 meters to my right, caught in crossfire from the realigned brown dwarf elements, dropped without ceremony by people who had been on his payroll an hour ago. The field made the argument for me. And you don't have time. The clock on that descent started before I finished my last sentence. That last point mattered most. I let it occupy the space between us for a moment without rushing past it. I'm going to make this simple. I gestured toward the object, still half buried in the field's turned earth, still faintly present in the way it had been since Joseph touched it, like something that had woken up and had not yet decided to go back to sleep. You came here for the cipher. You want it? Take it. That landed differently than anything I had said since he stepped off his shuttle. I could see it in the quality of his attention. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of someone who had prepared for several possible moves and had not included this one. The boy stays with me. My voice dropped to a register, that was not a threat so much as a fact being stated in advance of any alternative position being offered. That part is not negotiable, and it was never going to be negotiable. He's 13 years old, and he doesn't belong in whatever you're building toward. Behind me, Favai was still working, step by step, patient and methodical, moving Joseph another meter away from the center of it while keeping the movement below the threshold of something that demanded immediate response. Three-Heel's eyes moved from the object to Joseph and back to me. The triangle of it, the calculation of which element was worth the most, and what the cost of reaching for any of them actually was, given the current state of the board. You are dictating terms from a position of instability. The words were flat, not bitter, just accurate. Yeah, that's pretty much been the theme of the entire day. A burst of gunfire cracked from the field's eastern edge, sharper than the previous exchanges, closer to resolution. The brown dwarf realignment was pushing toward its conclusion out there, the Killar elements getting smaller and more isolated by the minute. Three-Heel heard it without looking. He was past the point of monitoring the flanks. Then Vrolksen stepped forward, just enough to enter the space between us, not crowding it, not claiming it, just making his presence in it deliberate rather than incidental. Three-Heel's attention moved to him with the focused interest of someone recalculating a new variable that had just declared itself relevant. Vrolksen's voice carried the same measured quality it always did. Nothing performed about it. Be careful, Three-Heel. Three-Heel did not respond immediately. He was already assessing what this entry meant, what authority it carried, what options it opened or closed. I have been observing Captain Hansen throughout this operation, Vrolksen continued. I kept my eyes on Three-Heel and did not look at him. I will tell you what I have concluded. He improvises. He does not follow the expected path, and he is rarely incorrect when he departs from it. That produced something. Small, controlled, but visible in the way Three-Heel's jaw set. He has something you never cultivated, Vrolksen added. I found myself looking at him for just a second despite myself. Vrolksen met the glance without adjusting his posture. Loyalty. Freely given, not extracted. He recovered the Miri male from your operation and returned him to his people without conditions, without leverage, without extracting any advantage from the situation he had every tactical reason to exploit. He carries their envoy aboard his ship at this moment. The Mari are observing this exchange in real time. A brief pause that carried weight. Consider what that means for what you do next. Three-Heel's expression shifted, not anger. Nothing as simple or readable as that. Something more precise. The hardening that happens when a person sees clearly, perhaps for the first time in a concentrated way, the contrast between what they built and what someone else built, and understands that the difference has consequences they did not adequately price. All you have ever commanded, Vrolksen continued, his voice steady, is fear and the terms of a contract. He glanced once, briefly, toward the field's edge where the sounds of the engagement had changed quality again. Fewer exchanges, longer pauses, the acoustic signature of a force that was consolidating rather than advancing. And that contract appears to have reached its natural conclusion. The silence that followed was heavy, not empty, full of everything that had been said, and everything both of us were calculating about what came next. Three-Heel did not look away from me. The balance between us had shifted in a way that was not dramatic and did not make him less dangerous, but was real, and both of us knew it. The difference between certainty and the absence of certainty, even when everything visible stays the same. I closed the remaining distance between us to something that required a decision from him rather than continued calculation. You can maintain the position that you still control the outcome of this. You can tell yourself you've accounted for every variable and the board still runs in your direction. I shook my head once. But the fang is falling, and your forces are done, and you've got about 90 seconds before that becomes impossible to ignore from the ground. You haven't accounted for all of it. You know that. I know that. The only question left is what you do with the time you have. Hill held my gaze. Unblinking, processing, still running whatever sequence he ran when the variables changed faster than the plan could accommodate. Still dangerous. I had not let that drop for a single second of this conversation, because a dangerous person does not become less dangerous when their position weakens. Sometimes they become more so, but the ground he had been standing on when his shuttle touched down and the ground he was standing on now were not the same. Above us, the sky was still clear and ordinary. That would not last. You can calculate every scenario available to you from this position, but nobody can account for all of it. Not you, not me. The difference is, I've stopped trying to, and you haven't admitted it yet. Somewhere above us, beyond the atmosphere the math Bishop had done was expressing itself in the form of something very large and very fast, running out of the velocity it needed to stay in orbit. It did not care about leverage or position or who had made better decisions on the ground today. It just fell, the way everything falls when the energy runs out. And it was going to land very close to where we were standing. Hill knew that as well as I did. The clock was running whether he was ready to acknowledge it or not. 56 cascade. I felt it before I saw it. Not sound, not movement, something else. Like the air had tightened around a specific point, like pressure finding its center. Joseph stopped walking. Fivai felt it too. Her grip on his arm shifted, not pulling anymore, just holding, like she understood something was about to happen and did not want him facing it without contact. Varos did not move. Hill did just a fraction that was enough. Joseph turned, not toward me, not toward Fivai, toward the object. "Joseph," I started. Too late. He stepped forward. Not fast, not panicked, deliberate, like something had aligned him with it, and the step was simply the physical consequence of that. Fivai did not try to stop him. She let go. That was the tell. He reached out and touched it. The field changed. No explosion, no flash, just reaction, the surface shifting under his hand, geometry resolving in ways that only made sense if you were looking directly at it. Light moved across the object, not like illumination, but like recognition. Like something that had been waiting a very long time had just confirmed it was done waiting. Joseph inhaled sharply. I felt it in my chest, pressure, the weight of something significant happening that I did not have the framework to understand fully. Hill moved. One step forward, decisive, his calculation finally producing an action. Varos shifted instantly to cut the angle, placing himself exactly where he needed to be without hesitation or instruction. Volkson moved too, not aggressively, just enough to make clear the line existed, and he was standing on it. Everything was moving now, and I did not have time to understand any of it. Did not need to. That was the moment. No more calculation, no more waiting for better information. I stepped forward. Hill. He stopped. Not because of me specifically, because he had to choose, and choosing required stopping, so I gave him the shape of it. 3 options. Voice level. You can come for the boy. Joseph stood with his hand still on the object, not pulling away, not letting go, the light moving under his fingers like it was responding to something the rest of us could not feel. You can go for the artifact. The surface shifted again as I said it, the response visible to everyone. Or you can walk away. Silence pressed in. Behind us, something low and distant rumbled across the sky. Not here yet. Coming. Threehill's eyes moved between Joseph and the object with the quality of someone running a final calculation and finding that the variables had changed since they started. You are presenting this as a choice. It is. He looked at me directly. You believe you control the outcome. No, I believe you don't. That landed, because it was true for both of us, and he was honest enough to know it. The object pulsed again, subtle, contained, syncing with something neither of us understood well enough to name. Joseph did not move, did not look away from whatever he was seeing or feeling at the point of contact. Threehill exhaled, short, controlled, the kind of exhale that does not signal acceptance so much as the closing of a calculation. The numbers had finished arriving. The answer they produced was the action he was about to take. He stepped back. Once, then again. The movement carried no urgency. The deliberateness was the message, the same deliberateness he had brought to every room in this operation, applied now to a withdrawal he was choosing rather than being driven to. Varos did not follow. Did not need to. Threehill walked toward his shuttle, measured, precise, the same controlled authority he had arrived with intact in every step. He stopped at the base of the ramp and looked back at me. You may believe this is a victory. It is. A faint shift in his expression, not concession, something more precise. You have won today. That does not make it permanent. Nothing is. He studied me for a moment with the steady attention of someone committing something to memory rather than saying goodbye. The look held a fraction longer than it needed to. That was deliberate too. He wanted it to register. Be prepared. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words were placed where they would land. Flat, plain, the operational statement of someone who had already begun planning the next time we would face each other and was making sure I understood he had. I think you're cut off from your resources for a while, I said. Take some time, lick your wounds. A beat. I'll be ready. That was the part that mattered between us. The acknowledgement that this was a pause rather than an ending, and that we both understood it as such. Threehill turned and walked into the shuttle, the hatch sealed. Moments later it lifted, clean, controlled, no excess thrust. Not a retreat in the way retreats usually look. A withdrawal under control, on his timing, on his terms within whatever terms remained available to him. He had chosen the angle and committed to it, and the shuttle's departure carried the same calibrated authority he had carried into the field. I watched it go until it was small enough to stop watching. Then I turned back. Joseph was still there, hand on the object, light moving in slow patterns under his fingers, the contact apparently ongoing in ways I could not observe directly. The object was not responding to anything else in the field, not to Varro standing 2 meters away, not to Fevai now watching from just behind him. Just to him, specifically and continuously. The rumble overhead grew louder, closer. The fang's descent was making itself known through the atmosphere in a way that would be visible soon. Everything was still in motion. Everything was still unresolved in the ways that would take longer than today to work through. But one thing was clear. Standing in that field with light moving under a teenager's hand and gravity making its final argument in the sky above us. The cascade had started. Whatever it meant, whatever it led to, whatever the object was doing and why Joseph was the one it had chosen to do it with, none of that was stopping now. It was only the beginning. 57 collision. The light did not fade when Joseph pulled his hand back. It lingered, not bright, not blinding, just present like the object had woken up and had not yet decided whether to go back to sleep. Joseph stood there staring at it, breathing a little faster than normal, like he was not entirely sure what he had done, or what it had done in return. Fevai was already moving, circling with her scanner, focused and intent the way she got when data came in faster than her working model could accommodate. Varos held position. Volkson watched everything, and I was standing in the middle of a field trying to make sense of something that did not particularly want to be understood. Then I heard boots behind us. Not ours. I turned. Abraham Thompson stepped into the field. He had moved faster than I expected, not panicked, not reckless, just determined in the way of someone who had stopped waiting for information and decided to find it himself. His eyes went to Joseph first, then shifted to the object, and the light still moving slowly across its surface. "What is that?" Nobody answered immediately. He stepped closer. Joseph looked at him with something like relief breaking across his face. "Father," but Abraham was not looking at him anymore. He was looking at the object, at its movement, at the way it had clearly responded to something, and was still responding. "You touched it." Joseph nodded. "I didn't mean to at first, but then—" Abraham stepped past him. Fevai did not move to stop him, which told me she wanted to see what happened as much as I did. He reached out, slower than Joseph had, more cautious, his hand hovering for just a moment before making contact. Nothing. No light. No shift. No recognition. Just inert material beneath his fingers, unchanged and unresponsive. Abraham pulled his hand back and looked at Joseph, then at the object, with the expression of someone who had just received information that raised more questions than it answered. "It doesn't respond." Fevai was already scanning Abraham, then Joseph, then the object, her movements tight and rapid. "The response is isolated." "Meaning?" I asked. She did not look up. "It is not responding to a purely human genetic profile, nor a purely Lennian one." Joseph shifted. "What does that mean?" She finally looked at him directly. "It means you are expressing a genetic condition that is not present in him." She nodded toward Abraham. "And not present in Varos." Varos said nothing. He did not need to. Joseph looked between them. "I don't understand." "Neither do I, not fully." She lowered the scanner and let the data sit a moment longer. "What I can say is what the configuration is not. It is not a recent acquisition. The pattern does not match anything that would result from interaction within the last several generations." She chose words with her usual precision. Eden was settled before humans made first contact with the Lennians 30 years ago. The marker did not enter your line through any contact in your lifetime, your father's, or his father's. Abraham's expression hardened by a fraction. "Then where?" Fevai's voice stayed level. "The most parsimonious explanation is older, considerably older. There was a period in Earth's prehistory when Lennian and human ancestors coexisted on the same planet, before the Lennian populations that survived were relocated. Those who remained did not survive. Their birth rate was approximately 2% too low for population stability, or their death rate 2% too high. The distinction does not matter at this remove. They died out, slowly, across many generations." She looked at Joseph again. "It is possible. I am being careful about the word possible, that somewhere in that coexistence, a human and a Lennian produced offspring. A specific cross-species pairing whose genetic contribution survived through a human lineage when its Lennian half did not. If that occurred even once, and the resulting alleles passed downward through enough generations diluted but intact, the pattern in your DNA could be the trace of it. Approximately 1% expression. Specific allele combination." Joseph said nothing. Abraham said nothing. "To my knowledge, you are the only person currently living in whom this specific combination has expressed in this specific configuration, which is what the artifact is responding to." Silence held the field for a beat. I worked through what she had just said. A teenager from a low-tech farming community, on an independent world, descended through some unknown chain, from a single ancient pairing nobody had recorded, and nobody had remembered, carrying a 1% genetic remnant that an alien artifact buried beneath his family's land had been waiting for. Whatever the artifact had been built to do, Joseph was the lock and the key in the same body. That was a lot to land on a 13-year-old standing in a field. Vivai shifted, and the clinical register adjusted to something fractionally softer. We should remove both the subject and the artifact to a controlled environment for proper study. There it was. Straight to it, no preamble. Define remove, I said. We take him and the object to Earth, she said, without hesitation. Joseph stiffened. Abraham did not move for a moment, and then it landed. No. Firm, not loud, final. You are not taking my son. Vivai turned toward him with the expression she used when she was about to explain something she considered straightforward. This is not a preference-based request. It is a recommendation derived from incomplete data and the potential for significant. No. This time it carried the full weight of someone who had made a decision and was done making it. He stepped closer to Joseph and placed himself beside him, between his son and the rest of us. I moved before this hardened into something that could not be walked back. Hold on. Vivai stopped. Abraham looked at me with the measuring attention of someone deciding whether I was worth listening to. He's not going to be harmed. That mattered to him. I could see it in how he held himself. But it was not enough on its own. He doesn't leave here. Not without choosing to. That landed differently. Something shifted in his posture, small but present. Joseph looked at me, then at his father, then at the object still glowing, still moving in its slow patterns as though it had found what it was looking for, and was in no hurry now that it had. I'm not taking anyone anywhere against their will. If he goes, it's because he decides to. Abraham held my gaze and weighed that. I let him. Then a sound rolled across the sky. Low at first, distant, but building with the quality of something very large moving very fast through air that was not designed to accommodate it. We all looked up simultaneously. A streak cut through the upper atmosphere, fire blooming across its surface as shock heating wrapped around it, the object tearing through at a speed that left a visible scar across the sky. The fang, still supersonic, still carrying more mass and momentum than any controlled landing could absorb. Everyone get down. Too late! The sonic boom hit like a wall, pressure and sound and force arriving together, the air cracking, the ground trembling under it. Everything blurred for a moment. Joseph stumbled. Abraham caught him. Vivai kept her footing. Varos did not move. Vrolkson barely shifted. I steadied myself and tracked the fire across the sky as the fangs screamed overhead. Bleeding velocity, but not enough. Not nearly enough to change the fundamental outcome of what physics had already decided. It was coming down. Somewhere close. The sound rolled outward and echoed across the land, fading slowly in the way sounds fade when they have already done everything they came to do. I looked back at Joseph, at the object, at the light still moving under the place his hand had been. Whatever came next, we were out of time to figure it out from a safe distance. 58 impact. The triage center had grown faster than Narahimura expected. What had started as a single cleared space in the village center had expanded into something closer to organized chaos. Blankets across the ground, makeshift stretchers, villagers clustered in tight groups, while she moved between them with the controlled urgency of someone who had learned that stopping, even briefly, cost more than it saved. A child with a fever stabilized. A man with a fractured arm, splinted. A woman with a burn across her shoulder, treated and wrapped. One problem at a time. That was how you kept the world from collapsing around you. Solve the thing directly in front of you, and then move to the next one. Hernandez pushed into the center of the village with her weapon still up and her posture tight but controlled. They made it in. She nodded toward David and Sarah, now seated near one of the blankets. Himura glanced over, both shaken, both alive. Keep them together, watch for shock. Hernandez moved off without another word. Across the square, Kemov and his Marines had regrouped into a tight formation, weapons angled outward, covering approaches. Not relaxed, nowhere close, but contained and functional, which was what the situation required. Himura allowed herself half a second. Then she looked around the center again and noted what she did not like. Too many people in too small a space, too exposed, with too little cover if anything changed. Her eyes moved toward the edge of the village, toward the open field. She had told Abraham to stay here where she could see him. He had not listened. Of course he had not. She exhaled. Then we adapt. The ground trembled faintly, subtle enough that she felt it through her boots before she processed it consciously. Not from the fighting. Something else, something with more mass behind it. Then Bishop's voice cut across comms, clear and immediate. The Fang is suborbital. Trajectory indicates atmospheric descent at uncontrolled velocity. A beat. Projected impact close to your position. Himura did not need the elaboration. She had seen enough atmospheric entry profiles to understand the distinction between a landing and an impact, and what Bishop was describing was not a landing. Everyone, listen to me. Her voice cut through the ambient noise with the clarity of someone who had learned how to make herself heard in chaos without sounding panicked. People turned, not all at once, but enough. We have to leave the village center. Now, move to the open field. Stay together. Confusion and fear started rising immediately. She did not give them room. Hernandez was already moving, herding people with sharp, efficient gestures. On your feet, let's go. Kemov stepped forward, his voice low but carrying the way voices carry when they have been trained to reach people who are close to losing composure. You heard her. Move. The Marines spread out and began converting scattered motion into something directional, guiding, pushing gently where needed, covering the flanks. Himura moved with them, shifting from patient to patient, helping those who could not move quickly, directing those who could toward the people who needed assistance. Take them. She pointed one of the villagers toward a cluster of children. Stay together. Don't stop moving. The ground trembled again, this time stronger. A distant roar followed, low and growing, the kind of sound that started below hearing and climbed through it, like the atmosphere itself was being forced to accommodate something it had not been built for. Himura did not look up. She knew what was coming, and she did not need to see it yet. Keep moving. The flow found its shape gradually, messy at first, fear and confusion working against each other, but then direction asserted itself, and people began moving the same way, away from the center and toward the open ground beyond the village. Not safe, exactly, less dangerous. In the circumstances, that was the only standard that mattered. Hernandez came back past her, checking the perimeter. Field's clear enough. It'll have to be. Kemov fell in alongside them, scanning the horizon. Impact radius? Too close. That was the truth, and precision would have required information she did not have, and time she did not have to use it. They worked with what they had. Another tremor, stronger than the last, and the sound that followed it was different, sharper, tearing across the sky in a way that made people stop moving and look up instinctively. Now they saw it. Fire cutting through the upper atmosphere, a streak that did not belong to anything natural, too fast and too large and too real. The Fang committed to a descent that physics had taken out of everyone's hands. Fear moved through the crowd immediately and visibly. Himura stepped forward and raised her voice above it. "Do not stop! Keep moving to the field!" They listened now. Fear had simplified the decision, stripped away hesitation, leaving only motion, which was exactly what she needed from them. People moved faster, more focused, the self-organizing momentum of a crowd that had found a single shared objective. Himura turned and scanned for stragglers, anyone falling behind, anyone who could not maintain the pace. She found them and moved to them, helped them forward, kept them in the flow. Because the job was not only whether anyone was ready for it or not. As the last of the villagers cleared the village center, Himura finally looked up. She saw exactly how little time remained. 59. Aftermath. I saw them before I heard them. Movement breaking from the tree line, people spilling into the field in uneven waves, controlled but barely. Fear having taken the lead with discipline, just trying to keep pace behind it. Then I saw her. Nara Himura moving at the front of it, directing people, pulling them forward, keeping the flow from collapsing into itself. Hernandez just off her flank. Kimov and the Marines spreading behind them, converting what could have been a rout into something that resembled a plan. They had made it, most of them. I moved forward to meet the first group as they reached the field's edge. "You're clear here. Stay together, stay low." My voice carried just enough to be useful without adding to the noise. Himura did not slow. She was already working, checking people as they arrived, sorting them into groups, scanning for injuries with the efficiency of someone who had stopped distinguishing between moving and doing because they were the same thing. "You cut that close." "We didn't have a choice," she kept moving. "Fair enough." I looked past her and counted, not precisely, but enough. The numbers were wrong. There were gaps where there should not have been, people who should have been here and were not. I felt the change in the air before I finished the thought. Then the sky tore open. The Fang came in fast and low, still shedding speed, but not nearly enough of it. Fire wrapped around the hull as shock heating tore at the structure. The whole thing punching through the lower atmosphere with the violence of something too massive to be stopped by anything as thin as air. It crossed overhead like a falling god, and for one suspended moment, it filled the sky entirely. Then impact. The ground answered hard. The shock wave rolled out across the valley, pressure, heat, and sound arriving as one thing rather than three, hitting us physically, knocking people off balance, flattening the grass in a wave that did not spend itself until it had reached everything there was to reach. I braced, held my ground, and watched it happen. A plume rose where the town had been. Not just smoke, fire, too much of it. Feeding on wood construction and close spacing and dry conditions, the kind of fire that does not wait for assessment. I exhaled slowly. "Damn it!" Himura was already moving through the nearest people, checking for shockwave injuries. Hernandez turned back toward the field's edge, scanning for anyone thrown clear who had not made it to the group. Kimov stepped up beside me, and we both looked toward the town. "They're not all here." "I know." The flames were spreading fast now, jumping between structures with the ease of something that had found exactly the conditions it needed. Anyone still inside, I pushed it away. There was nothing for them to do through that fire, not yet, maybe not for a while. I turned back to the field. Most of them were here. Alive, shaken, lit by the glow of a town that was no longer a town. That had to count for something, even when it did not feel like enough. "Kimov." He looked at me. "Secure the object. Full perimeter. Nobody gets near it without clearance." One nod. He signaled the Marines, and they moved immediately, spreading out and locking down the area around the artifact with the efficiency of people who had been told to do one specific thing and understood exactly what it meant. I looked back toward the impact site. If Bishop's strikes had done what they were designed to do, if the trajectory had held the way we needed it to, there was a possibility, small but real, that something had survived the descent. The database 3 heel had taken from Trappist 1, whatever he had been carrying. We would have to go out there and check. Not now, not through that heat and that instability. We would wait, watch the fire burn down to something navigable, then move when it made sense to move. That was the only timeline available. I turned back to the field and looked at what the situation had produced. Families clustered together, children held close, faces turned toward the glow of burning structures. Abraham stood with Joseph a short distance from the main group, both of them watching the fire with the stillness of people trying to understand something that did not resolve into understanding easily. This was not over. We both knew it. I walked a few steps forward and stopped, because this was the part nobody trains you for. Winning a fight does not mean you have won the outcome, and the gap between those two things was standing in front of me in the form of people whose home was burning because of decisions made in systems they had never been part of. We kept most of them alive, I said quietly. Kimov did not answer. He did not need to, and I was not really saying it to him. I looked out across the field, survivors, fire, the artifact with its perimeter of Marines, the gap in the sky where the Fang had come through. Whatever trust was going to exist between us and these people going forward was not going to come from explanations or justifications. It would come from what happened next, in the hours and days after this, when the fire died down and the decisions about what to do had to be made in full view of everyone affected. From their perspective, we had brought this here. The flames climbed higher. I felt the heat from where I stood, across the field, and understood with complete clarity that the consequences of this were going to arrive whether I was ready for them or not, one way or another. 60% cleanup. A few days after the crash, time stopped making sense. Not dramatically, no single moment where everything slowed and announced itself. It just stretched, blurred at the edges. 1 shuttle run became 3, 3 became 5, and somewhere in the middle of that, I stopped counting transits between the surface and Singapore because the number had stopped being the relevant variable. What mattered was that people were still alive, and that we kept them that way. Counting the survivors was easier than counting the ones we had lost. The field had become the center of everything, not by design but by necessity. Open space, visibility, and enough room to organize something functional out of what remained. Makeshift shelters along the perimeter, tools scavenged and repurposed, a system assembling itself because it had no choice. No reinforcements, no relief ships. Just the crew and whatever we could hold together until something changed. The rhythm established itself fast, down to the surface. Check the perimeter, coordinate the structure we had improvised, food, water, triage, basic shelter. Back up to the ship, log what we had learned, reassign resources, try to stay one problem ahead of the next one. Then back down again. No clean breaks, no real sleep cycle. Just movement and decision stacked on each other until the only anchor was whatever task came next. This was what the space between crisis and aftermath actually looked like. Everything still fragile. Nothing guaranteed. The emergency over, but nothing safe yet. I told Bishop to get some rest late on the first day. She did not argue much. That told me everything. Amanda Bishop arguing is her baseline. It's how she refines things, pushes back, recalculates, and improves whatever plan is in front of her. When she accepts an order without trying to negotiate it, she is already past where she should have stopped. 8 hours. I'm fine, she said automatically. I'm not asking. She held my gaze for a moment, measuring the distance between what she wanted to do and what she actually had left. Then a small nod. 8, she said. 8. She left the bridge without another word. I watched her go, then turned back to the board, orbital position holding. Surface teams spread thin but functional. No external support inbound yet. Everything still on us. I sent the courier drone to Houston shortly after. Full report, no omissions. Operational summary, casualty estimates, status of Eden, status of the Fang's wreckage, and a formal request for immediate support. I paused on the wording before I finalized it. Not because I did not know what to say, because I knew exactly what I was saying and what it meant. Refugees, not villagers, not settlers, refugees. Because their town was gone, because they were not returning to what they had had, and because we were part of what made that happen, whether we liked that accounting or not. I transmitted and watched the drone launch on a clean trajectory, accelerating away from Eden into the dark. No response coming anytime soon. That was the reality of operating out here. You make the call, then you live with it while the light takes its time carrying the news. 2 days in, Kimoff and I boarded what remained of the Fang. The fires had died down enough to make it possible. Not safe, possible. We sat down outside the main debris field and approached on foot. The Fang dominated the landscape even in pieces, hull sections scattered across a wide impact zone. The main structure twisted into something that barely referenced what it had been. From orbit, it had looked damaged. From the ground, it looked broken in a way that meant it had been completely broken. We went in slowly. Standard procedure? Kimoff on point, weapon low, eyes moving. I followed behind him, mapping the interior against what it should have been. Heat still radiated off hull sections. Not enough to stop us. Just enough to remind you how recently it had come down. We swept compartment by compartment damage, structural collapse, bodies. More than I wanted to count, so I stopped trying. About 40 minutes in, we reached what had been a cargo hold. Partially intact, just enough structure remaining to read the space. Storage mounts twisted out of alignment, securing systems ripped free from the walls. Empty. I stopped and looked at it. Kimoff stepped up beside me and scanned the same area. Nothing? Yeah. It did not hit at once. It settled piece by piece, the shape of it assembling itself from what was missing rather than what was there. He moved it. Explain. He knew we'd come here. Knew we'd assume the Trappist artifact was on this ship, so he gave us a ship to chase and kept the real one somewhere else. I gestured at the empty hold. His shuttle, probably. When he walked away from the field, that's when he already had it. Kimoff considered that. He withdrew without engaging for the object, or the boy. Yeah, he chose something we weren't tracking. That part still did not sit right. Three Heel had had the opportunity in that field, Joseph present, the artifact responding, everything in motion. And he had walked away from both of them. Smart. Did not mean I liked it. We finished the sweep anyway. Every accessible compartment, no shortcuts, no assumptions. Found nothing else. So we left, because there was nothing left to find. Back aboard Singapore, the work did not slow. It changed register, from immediate threat to endurance. Fevai had claimed a section of the cargo bay around the field object. Scanners, sensors, iteration, working it like a problem she had decided owed her an answer regardless of how long it took to provide one. I checked in once. Progress? Minimal. She did not look up. It did not change her approach. If anything, the resistance made her more methodical. That was Fevai. An obstacle was just a problem that had not been properly characterized yet. At some point, a poker game materialized in the mess. I did not ask who started it. I passed through once and found Kimov and Bishop explaining the rules to Varos while Gibby managed the chips, and Fev I observed from the side with the expression she reserved for new systems. No real currency, Bishop was saying. Regulations. Understood. The mechanics did not take him long. Once he had them, the rest followed naturally. No tells, no hesitation, a read on the table that apparently came standard. Within an hour, he was winning consistently. Kimov did not look surprised. Bishop did. Gibby shook his head slowly. We should have seen that coming, he muttered. I kept moving. Himura came back aboard late on the second day. She had stayed on the surface longer than anyone, longer than I had wanted, and it showed not dramatically, no collapse, just the emptiness of someone who had been running on reserve past the point where they should have stopped and refueled. You're done, I told her. I still have. You're done. She looked like she was marshalling an argument, then did not use it. That alone told me how far past empty she was. 8 hours. My quarters, not the bunks. That produced a reaction from her, from the ambient awareness of the crew nearby, and specifically from Hernandez, who caught it with a sidelong glance and a hint of a smile she was fairly certain I did not notice. Small ship. People notice things. It did not matter. Himura needed rest, and that was the only variable in the equation. 8 hours, she said. 8. By the end of the third day we were holding, not stable, not safe, holding. The field was as organized as it could be without outside support. Food being distributed, injuries being managed, a shelter that was adequate in the way that means barely, but consistently. I stood at the field's edge that night and looked out over what remained. No lights except what we had set up, no structure except what we had built, no certainty extending beyond the next few hours. But people were alive, and they were adapting, the way people always do when they have no other available option. I looked up. Singapore held in orbit above us, patient and steady, still there. Until someone else arrived, we were it, and we were still in it. 61, shell game. The football turned in my hands. Toss, catch, rotate, repeat. The ready room was quiet in the way it gets after something loud has finally stopped, when your brain is still running at operational tempo, but the operational part is done, and the thinking part is trying to catch up. I had been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to identify exactly what was bothering me. Not the village. I understood the village. That was a cost I could account for, could carry, could look at directly without flinching. We had gotten most of them out. The relief ship had been sent for, but recovery was underway regardless. That weight had a shape, and I knew how to hold it. It was not Three-Hill walking away from the field either. I had expected that possibility the moment he landed, and the reality of the situation made it clear that a direct confrontation was not his preference. A man like Three-Hill does not bring a ship and a contracted force into a contested planetary insertion without a plan that accounts for not getting everything he came for. What was bothering me was simpler than that, and worse. I looked up at the model ships on the shelf above the desk. The HMS Victory, oak and canvas, 104 guns, the thing Nelson had stood on at Trafalgar. Nobody had told him to do it the way he did it. He had read the geometry of the engagement and acted on what he understood before anyone else was seeing the same picture. The Enterprise CV-6. The carrier that should not have survived the Pacific campaign and did anyway, Midway, Guadalcanal, damage control teams and stubbornness, and the refusal of people who had decided the ship was not finished yet. The Apollo Command Module, small and blunt-nosed, built to do exactly one thing, and successful because the math was right. The people were willing, and nothing else. I looked at them for a while. Then I looked at Kennedy, the painting I had had since the academy, not the speech, not the moment of triumph, the other one. Head slightly down. the weight of something unresolved pressing on him, a decision still forming that he already understood the cost of before he finished making it. A man being honest with himself about what he was dealing with, rather than what he wished he was dealing with. I had always liked that one better than the triumphant portraits. The football turned. Here's what I knew. Three-Heel had come to Eden for the artifact. Just the artifact, the cipher. He had been informed about it even though his connections to the Whisper network had been severed, which meant someone with their own power and their own Whisper network access had identified the Eden artifact and pointed him toward it, before we even knew it existed ourselves. His information chain had been faster than ours, because we had to rendezvous with a Miri and a Concord warden at Wolf 359 first. That meant he had been building intelligence on Eden while we were still processing the Trappist connection. Joseph had not been part of his plan. He could not have been. Three-Heel had not known about Joseph's genetic response to the object until he arrived in that field and saw it happening in front of him. Everything before that landing had been oriented around one objective, the Eden cipher. Get in, take it, leave before coalition forces could respond. What Joseph represented, the genetic recombination, the threshold condition, the fact that a 13-year-old farmer on a deliberately low-tech independent world could activate an alien artifact through contact, that was information Three-Heel had acquired by accident, by being in the right field at the right moment, by watching something none of us had anticipated. And then he had walked away from it. That was the part that was sitting wrong. He had seen something genuinely unprecedented, a human carrying Lennian genetic markers at functional levels, triggering a response in alien technology that no one else in that field could produce. And he had turned around, boarded his shuttle, and left. Not because he did not understand the significance. Three-Heel was too sharp for that. Because he had already made a different calculation. I set the football down on the desk and looked at Kennedy again. The Trappist database was still out there. Three-Heel had moved it off the Fang before he ever entered Eden's atmosphere. The empty cargo hold had told that story clearly enough. He had committed an entire planetary operation as misdirection, put us on a ship he knew we would board and sweep, and moved the actual objective somewhere we were not looking. A shell game. Clean and deliberate. He had the database. He had lost the Myri mail, the biological key Favai believed might be capable of decrypting it through the hive mind's non-linear processing architecture. That capability was gone, returned to his people, beyond Three-Heel's reach now. Which meant when he stood in that field and watched Joseph's hand light up the surface of that artifact, he was not seeing a curiosity. He was seeing a replacement, a different kind of key, one he had not planned for, had not expected, and could not take by force without triggering exactly the kind of response that would end his operational freedom permanently. Not with me standing there, not with a Concord warden 20 meters away, not with the Miri envoy aboard Singapore watching everything through sensor feeds in real time. So he had filed it, walked away with what he had, and somewhere in the dark between Eden and wherever he was going, he was revising his timeline around what he had seen. I exhaled slowly. Nelson had understood Villeneuve's formation better than Villeneuve did. Enterprise's damage control teams had understood the ship's structural tolerances better than the pilots attacking her. Kennedy had understood that the Cuba situation was a threshold event that could not be managed incrementally. The common thread was simple and uncomfortable. Understanding the thing in front of you is not sufficient if the other person is already 3 moves ahead on a different board. Three-Heel had come to Eden for the cipher. He had left with something more valuable than the cipher, knowledge. Specifically, the knowledge that there existed a human being whose genetic structure could interface with alien technology in ways without precedent in any recorded contact history. A boy living on an independent world under 19th century conditions who had no idea what he represented or why. Joseph was still on Eden. I picked the football back up. Toss. Catch. The question that mattered was not what Three-Heel had taken from Eden. That was answered. The question was what he was going to do with what he had seen, and how long before the revised calculation produced a revised operation, and whether we were going to understand the geometry of that before it arrived. I looked at the Apollo spacecraft model. One specific mission, specific constraints, specific window, and when the constraints changed, the people who brought it home had done it by finding a path within the new shape of the problem rather than recovering the original plan. Three-Heel was doing the same thing. I reached for the tablet on the corner of the desk and started writing, not a report, just thinking laid out somewhere I could look at it. Three-Heel, database. Joseph is variable he hadn't planned for. Timeline. And underneath all of it, the question that had been sitting at the bottom of everything since a construction crew in the Trappist system hit something with a plow that was not rock. The unknown intelligence behind the artifacts, behind the Lennian relocation, behind the pattern of discoveries that kept orienting itself around humanity. Was Three-Heel trying to stop that? Or was he trying to get ahead of it? I did not have an answer, but I had the right question now. That was usually where the real work started. 62. Choice. I was near the edge of the field when Abraham found me. He did not approach with any tension, just walked up and stopped a few feet away, hands at his sides, eyes steady in the way of someone who had already worked through the hard part of what they came to say. You said it would be his choice. I took a moment before answering, not because I had forgotten, because I understood exactly what he was asking underneath the words. I meant it. He nodded once. No pushback, no argument, no testing of the edges, just acceptance, clean and complete. That told me more about him than a longer response would have. Joseph was off to the side, about 20 meters away, watching the activity around him without participating directly. There was a quality to his attention that did not belong to someone a week removed from ordinary life. Focused, patient, taking in more than he was showing. He had seen too much too fast, and now he was working through the architecture of it. Abraham followed my gaze toward him, then looked upward, past the faint smoke still hanging in the air, past the atmosphere. Then he should see it. The ship. I looked up with him to where I knew Singapore was holding position in orbit. All right. There was not a reasonable argument against it. I flew them up myself. Bishop would have handled it cleanly, probably would have appreciated the task. But some moments do not call for delegation, not because you do not trust your people, but because the situation is different. This was one of those. The shuttle lifted cleanly, cutting through the atmosphere on a controlled burn. Eden dropped away beneath us. Patchwork terrain. The long scar where the fang had come down, still visible from altitude if you knew the geography. Joseph stayed quiet through the ascent. He did not press against the viewport the way most first-timers do. Just watched, absorbed, sat with it. Abraham kept his hands resting on his knees and took it in at a different pace, measured, grounded, the way he seemed to do everything. Neither of them spoke until we cleared into orbit and Singapore came into view. That's it? That's it. He studied her for a moment. She's smaller than I expected. Most things are from a distance. Singapore is not large by any standard that has numbers attached to it. She's a frigate, tight, efficient, every meter accounted for, every system integrated with something else. No excess, no wasted space. Built around function in a way that does not leave room for anything that does not earn its place. But she is home. For us, anyway. We docked on standard procedure. No ceremony. Airlock cycled. I led them through. Welcome aboard. Because there was not anything more precise to call it. Joseph stepped in first. You could see the shift in him immediately, not fear, more like awareness sharpening. The alertness of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory who had decided not to retreat from it. That was a good sign. I took them through deck by deck. Kept it purposeful, what they needed to understand, not an exhaustive inventory of every system. Operations flow through this junction. Command, engineering, medical, everything routes back here. Abraham tracked it. Joseph looked at everything, every bulkhead, every access panel, every piece of equipment we passed. Not overwhelmed, cataloging, building a picture. In engineering, Varos glanced up from a panel, assessed them in the way he assessed everything, and gave a small nod. Additional personnel. Visitors. He accepted the distinction without comment and returned to work. That was Varos. Gibby found us before I went looking for him. That was the only way that was ever going to go. Captain, with the tone of someone who had already decided how the next 20 minutes were unfolding. You're bringing guests aboard and not mentioning it? You found us anyway. Always do. He turned to Abraham and Joseph with the easy certainty of someone receiving expected company rather than meeting strangers. Welcome aboard. Already in motion toward something that smelled entirely too good for a naval frigate operating out of a contested system. Timing's good, I've got something going. Abraham glanced at me. I did not offer clarification. Joseph moved fractionally closer to the galley, drawn by the smell before the thought caught up with the instinct. Gibby clocked it immediately. Yeah. He pointed a utensil at Joseph. That's exactly what I was hoping to see. What is it? Joseph asked. Gibby grinned. Dangerous question. Abraham still had not entirely worked out what to make of any of this. That was understandable. Joseph, on the other hand, was visibly starting to relax. His shoulders, the set of his jaw, something around the eyes. That mattered more than Abraham's confusion. I made the introductions as we moved through the ship. Bishop at the helm, precise and professional. A quick nod without breaking her focus. Kimov, standing slightly apart, running his own assessment, then giving Abraham a look that communicated something across the gap between them before he stepped back. Himura in medical, calm and direct, taking Joseph's measure with the practiced attention of someone who treats before she speaks and always knows more than she has said. Everyone stayed in their lane. Present, professional, exactly what they needed to be. That was the crew. Then we came to E. No framing device makes that introduction easier, so I kept it direct. Abraham, this is E. E did not move in the ways people unconsciously expect movement. Observation first, always. Processing before responding, the way she approached everything. Abraham took a measured step forward. Thank you for coming to help. Careful words, considered before they left his mouth. E watched him. The translator caught up after a moment. Observation ongoing. Joseph stood just behind his father, listening to everything without offering anything. Are you part of the same group as the others? Abraham asked. Connected? Not identical? He nodded, as though that was sufficient for now. It was not comfortable, but it held, and nobody pushed toward a resolution that was not available yet. That is the actual mechanics of first contact. Measured steps, no forced understanding. Patience with the space where comprehension has not formed yet. The tension did not resolve itself into comfort, but it eased into something workable. By the time we moved on, no one had raised their voice, stepped back from the exchange, or looked for a reason to end it early. No one had headed for an airlock. That counted. On the way back toward the shuttle bay, Joseph slowed slightly. Do you live here? For now, yeah. He looked down the corridor, taking in the length of it, then back at me. It's different. That's one way to put it. He nodded and left it there. Did not need anything added. Back in the shuttle, prepping for descent, the silence held for a while. The engines were warming. Eden was waiting below us, patient in the way planets are patient. Then Joseph spoke. I need to go to Earth. I did not turn immediately. Abraham did. He looked at his son the way fathers look at sons who have just said something they understood was coming, but had not been ready to hear. Joseph kept his eyes forward. After what happened in the field, when I touched it, he paused, working through the words the way he worked through everything. It responded to me, not to my father, not to anyone else. It was waiting for me, and I do not know why, and I do not know what it means, but I know I'm not going to find that answer here. He glanced at me briefly and back to the viewport. Fivi said you have a place where it can be studied. I think I should be there when it is. Abraham did not answer right away. The silence in the shuttle changed quality, not heavier, just more occupied. A father absorbing that his son had reached a decision in his own time, in his own way, and was now sharing it rather than asking permission for it. You're sure? Abraham said. Not a question exactly, a confirmation request. No. Joseph said it plainly, without performance. I'm not sure of anything that happened to me down there, but I know I have to find out, and I cannot find out from home. I let that sit in the cabin for a moment before saying anything. He had earned the silence around it. You understand what you're asking for, I said carefully. Some of it. He met my eyes for the first time since he started speaking. I will understand more of it when I get there. I think that's how this works. Yeah, that was how this worked. I brought the shuttle off the deck and into the dark. Eden waiting below us in the middle distance, patient and permanent, and changed in ways that could not be undone. Whatever came next for Joseph Thompson was not mine to decide. That had always been the point. He had just made the decision. 63, assessment. The ready room was quiet in a way the rest of the ship never quite managed. Not silent. Singapore was never silent. Something was always humming underneath. Systems running, air cycling, the low, constant presence of a vessel live in its own mechanical way. But the ready room had a contained quality that the corridors and the bridge did not. Controlled. That was what the space was built for. I was at the viewport when Vrolksen came in. I had not summoned him. I did not need to. He moved when he decided to move, and when he appeared it meant something had already been resolved on his end before he crossed the threshold. The hatch slid open behind me without announcement. I will be making my report to the Concord wardens. No build-up, no approach, just the fact of it. I did not turn immediately. Through the viewport, Eden curved below us, the damage still visible if you knew the geography. Fires mostly out now, but the evidence of everything that had happened written into the terrain in ways that were not going anywhere. I turned. Vrolksen stood just inside the room, posture unchanged, presence carrying the steadiness he brought to every situation regardless of what it was. He did not take a seat. He did not move any further in. Just occupied the space he had chosen and observed. Figured. He studied me for a moment, not conversationally, not the way someone looks at you while deciding what to say next. Deliberate. The kind of attention that is collecting something, storing it precisely, intending to have it available later exactly as it is now. I was tasked with observation, evaluation. Of me. Of the situation, he corrected, and your function within it. That was the more accurate framing. I leaned back against the edge of the desk and gave him the space to continue. Part of that evaluation was determining whether direct intervention was required during this operation. A pause, not hesitation, just measured spacing before the conclusion. It was not. I let that land without rushing past it. Coming from someone else, the same words might have been a line in a standard report. From Volkson, who distributed conclusions with precision and without generosity, it carried a different weight. Good to know. He inclined his head slightly, not agreement in any human sense, just acknowledgement that the statement had been received. I observed how you handled Three-Heel. I did not fill that with anything, did not need to. I also observed your crew, their responses, their alignment with your decisions under pressure. A brief pause. You have their loyalty. He said it the way he said most things, flat, direct, without inflection that would indicate whether it was meant as praise or simply as data. That is not something Three-Heel ever cultivated, in any form. No judgment in it, no comparative tone. Just a distinction drawn cleanly between two approaches and their outcomes. Three-Heel had commanded through intimidation and contract. I had not. The results, apparently, were observable. I looked past him for a moment, through the open hatch toward the corridor beyond. Movement, systems operating, the ship running the way it was built to run. They're good people. They are effective. That was as close as he was going to get. I straightened up from the desk. What's the report going to say? He held my gaze with the same quality of attention he had brought in through the hatch. The Concord wardens will be informed that no corrective action was required, and that the situation resolved within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters. High praise. He did not react to that. Your methods are adaptive, he said after a moment. You don't operate from a fixed pattern. That a problem? It is atypical. I nodded once. I'll try to be more predictable next time. That produced a brief pause from him, not confusion, something more deliberate. Processing the statement and deciding what category it belonged to. Unnecessary, which was about as close as I'd seen him come to anything resembling dry humor. Silence settled in after that. Nothing remaining to negotiate, nothing left that needed clarification. He had what he had come for. So that's it. Yes. Another small, precise inclination of the head. Then he turned and moved back toward the hatch. No lingering, no closing pleasantries, just the clean economy of someone who stops when the task is complete. At the threshold, he paused. Not long enough to be called hesitation. Just long enough to add one more thing without turning back. You maintain cohesion. That is uncommon. Then he was gone. The hatch slid shut, and the room returned to its contained quiet. I stood at the viewport a moment longer, looking at Eden below, the scarred terrain. That field had become the center of everything. The place where a community that had chosen simplicity was now navigating something it had never asked to be part of. Cohesion. Loyalty. Words that sound straightforward until the situation arrives where they are the only thing between you and everything coming apart at once. Until you are standing in a field with a rogue former warden and a teenager who should not exist genetically, and a ship in orbit playing cat and mouse with something that outweighs it, and the only reason any of it holds together is that the people around you trust you and each other. I exhaled slowly and moved back to the desk. Out here you do not control the conditions. You do not get complete information, ideal circumstances, or decisions that look clean from every angle. You get a crew, and whether they are still with you when it actually matters. There was still work to do. 64. Departure. The relief ship came in on a controlled descent a few hours later. You could see it before you heard it, cutting through the upper atmosphere on a shallow vector, hull glowing just enough to mark its passage against the sky. Not fast, not aggressive. Deliberate. The kind of approach that communicated intent before anything was said. We're here to help, not to take over, even if, in practical terms, that was exactly what was about to happen. Human coalition markings ran clean along the hull. Medical, logistics, support, everything we had requested and more. I stood near the field's edge with Abraham as it came down, both of us watching the same thing from different angles. For him, it was the arrival of something that might hold together what remained of his community. For me, it was the moment our part in this ended, and someone else's began. The ship settled beyond the outer shelter line, thrusters kicking up dust in a controlled wash that people had already learned to brace against. Ramps deployed within minutes. Teams moved immediately, organized, purposeful, without the hesitation that comes from people who have not done this before. You can read a unit by how it arrives. These people knew exactly what they were walking into. Medics came off first, splitting into triage teams and moving toward the clusters of injured we had already flagged without needing direction. Behind them came logistics crews with portable systems, temporary structures, water filtration units, medical rigs, comms arrays. They did not pause to ask where things were needed. They had been briefed before they touched down. One of their officers crossed the field toward Himura, handed off a datapad, exchanged a few words. Quick, minimal, professional. A transfer of responsibility that did not require ceremony. She looked at me from across the space between us, not asking, informing, "They've got it." I gave a small nod. Good. That was what we had been holding things together to reach. The structural shift was immediate, even if it was not visible in any single thing you could point to. We had been operating on what we had: limited personnel, limited supplies, decisions made based on what was manageable in the moment. Now the system had changed around us. More people, more resources, more institutional capacity. That is when you step back, not because you want to, but because you should. Gibby was already deep in conversation with one of the logistics teams, explaining the food distribution system we had improvised, what had worked and what had not. Halfway between explaining and teaching, which was exactly his register. Kimov had his Marines pulling back from the perimeter in sequence, coordinating with coalition security to hand off coverage without leaving gaps in the transition. Bishop had checked in from orbit twice, confirming position and timing. Everything was aligning. That was the cue. Abraham stayed beside me a moment longer as the field shifted from survival mode into recovery operations. They'll help. They will? He watched the movement, teams organizing, structures going up, people being directed rather than wandering in the improvised way that desperation produces. They're not you. No, they're better equipped for this part. That was not modesty. It was accurate. We had done what the situation required when no one else was there. Now the people built for sustained recovery work had arrived, and the right call was to get out of their way. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. You're leaving. Yeah. Another nod. No argument, no attempt to change the shape of it. He understood the difference between what we had been doing and what came next, and he was too honest a person to pretend otherwise. Joseph stood nearby, watching the new arrivals with the same focused attention he had directed at everything over the past several days. Cataloging, building his picture. He looked over at me briefly, did not say anything. The look was enough. We lifted off not long after. Joseph sat behind me with a modest bag containing all of his possessions worth taking to Earth. The shuttle ride up was quieter than the descent days earlier. Less urgency, fewer unknowns. The field below us spread out in a patchwork that already looked more stable than it had any right to be, given what it had been through. Structure returning. The town was gone. What had replaced it was temporary, but it would hold. That is usually what you are working toward. Not restoration, just the point where it holds. Singapore received us without ceremony. Docking, cycling, transition. the familiar routine of coming back to the only place that qualified as home out here. I stepped through the airlock and paused just inside for a moment. The crew moved around me with the ease of people who knew their ship and their work. Systems running, stations manned, everything ready. Captain on deck. At ease. Already past it, I made my way to the bridge. Bishop was at the helm where she belonged, hands settled on the controls, eyes moving across multiple overlays simultaneously. She did not look up when I came in. Relief ship has full operational control on the ground. All our teams accounted for. Good. A slight nod. Clear to break orbit on your call. I stepped up beside her and looked out through the forward display. Eden hung below us, the damage smaller from this altitude than it was from the ground. It always looks smaller from up here. You lose the individual details, the losses, the things that do not register on a scan. Just a planet, just another world that had been one thing before we arrived, and was something different now. Take us out. Singapore pulled away clean. Thrusters fired in a controlled sequence, pushing us out of low orbit onto a departure vector. The planet began to shrink, slowly at first, then accelerating as the distance built. I stayed at the front of the bridge and watched it go. There is a moment when you leave a world that transitions from a place to a point of light. Eden reached that moment faster than I expected. One moment it was still terrain, atmosphere, somewhere you could picture walking on again. Then it was just light. Then nothing. FTL solution locked. I took the chair. Earth was waiting. The report was waiting. Everything that followed from both of those was waiting. Execute. The transition landed clean. Stars stretched and folded into the geometry of faster-than-light transit. The drives hummed, deepening just enough to register. I leaned back and let the ship's rhythm settle around me. This part always felt the same, regardless of what you were leaving behind. I ran through what I knew. Heel was still out there, having walked away from the field with something he had planned to take before he arrived. Maybe more than one thing. We had only seen part of whatever he was building toward, and the part we had seen had not been the part that mattered most to him. Joseph was aboard, Gibby trying his best to make him feel at home, with plenty of food for a growing boy going to Earth, the cradle of humanity, for the first time in his life. The field object sat in the cargo bay, unchanged, still not understood, having responded to one specific person for reasons nobody could yet explain. And the Trappist database was gone, not destroyed, not recovered. Just gone, somewhere ahead of us in Hill's possession, which meant he had not lost. He had changed the shape of the board and walked away from the table while we were still counting the pieces. That one bothered me more than the rest combined. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not long, just enough to let the noise settle. Then open them. Bridge steady. Crew in position. The ship doing exactly what it was built to do. On paper, the operation was complete. Objectives met, at least the ones that could be defined and measured. But that was not the full accounting, and I knew it. I looked out at the distorted field of stars stretching ahead of us and understood clearly that whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion on a colonial construction site in the Trappist system, when a cutter struck something that was not rock, it was nowhere close to finished. Not even close. Reverberation. It was quiet, not the operational kind, not the focused silence of a bridge running dark or a situation room where everyone is thinking too hard to speak. This was different. The still, preserved quiet of something that used to matter at the highest level, and had been held carefully in place ever since, like a moment someone decided was too significant to let dissolve into ordinary time. I sat in the visitors' viewing area above the old Apollo mission control that had been converted into a museum. The lights were low up here, the way they kept them for atmosphere rather than function. Below me, through the glass, the consoles sat exactly where they had been left a couple of centuries ago, rows of screens, chairs, and coffee cups frozen mid-use. The entire room was preserved to honor the people who had been doing the most consequential work of their lives, and had not bothered to tidy up before history decided to mark the moment. The technology was ancient by any standard that mattered now. The screens were cathode ray tubes. The system connected to mainframes down on the first floor of the building, 3 stories below where I was sitting. Nothing in that room could have interfaced with Singapore even if you handed it a translator. And yet, they had gotten off the planet with it. They had navigated to a body 384,000 kilometers away. They landed on it and came home, using mathematics and engineering and a large dose of human stubbornness that produces miracles when failure is not an option. I'd been sitting here since the debrief ended, which had been 2 hours ago and felt longer. The debrief itself had been held in a different building across the campus. Modern, active, full of people who had questioned decisions I had made under conditions none of them had to contend with when I was making them. That was the nature of debriefs. The people who do the work come home and explain themselves to the brass, and the brass does not always see it the same way the people who are actively on the mission see it. Admiral Archuleta ran it. Rear Admiral Blackwell was in the room, which helped. I laid out the full sequence: Trappist, Anchor Station, the Myri extraction, Wolf 359, Eden, the field, the Fangs crash in the middle of the village, Three Heels withdrawal, the aftermath, and answered every question that came at me with the same honesty I had tried to apply to every decision while it was happening. Some of the questions had been pointed. None of them had come from Archuleta or Blackwell. Vice Admiral Reyes had taken the lead from the other side. Procedural objections, in the same register he had used the night Archuleta originally selected me for Singapore's command. The questions framed as concerns about authorization and chain of command propriety, with the actual disagreement underneath. Reyes did not believe I should have had the command in the first place, and the operation we were debriefing had not changed his mind so much as reorganized the points he wanted to enter into the record about it. General Stratton was there with him. The Marines under my command had performed well, which left Stratton in the awkward position of having to acknowledge their conduct while disputing the operational decisions that had positioned them to make it. He did the disputing. The acknowledgement was a smaller proportion of his available time than it should have been. Both of them were operating from the same playbook they had been running since Archuleta first put me in the chair. Build a record. Even when you cannot block a decision, you log your dissent. So that the next time the same decision needs to be made, you have institutional documentation suggesting it should be made differently. That was how this part of the service worked. Reyes and Stratton were professionals at it. Archuleta absorbed the questions and rooted around them. Blackwell did the same from her end of the room. Between the two of them, they did not block Reyes or Stratton from saying what they had come to say. That would have given the dissent the shape of suppression rather than disagreement. But they answered every objection on the record with their own counterframing, which meant the eventual report would carry both views, and Reyes and Stratton would not have a clean win to file later. It was the same line Archuleta had been operating on since the start of this. The line he had told me he was put there to operate at, the one between the institution he had inherited and the one he believed it needed to become. He had used the word rivalry once, in Houston, before Singapore deployed. I had thought at the time he was overstating it. After this debrief, I no longer did. The door opened behind me. I did not turn. I already knew it was Narahimura. She crossed the room without hurrying and sat beside me. Her hand found mine in the dark, the kind of contact that did not require explanation because it was just her being present. I exhaled. How'd it go? I kept my eyes on the room below. I told them Eden matters, not because of what we found there, but because of what we did there and what we chose not to do. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her I had stopped taking for granted. I explained why I let Three Heel walk. I could have escalated. I had the weapon raised. Vrolksen was in the field. The moment existed where pushing harder was a viable option. A pause. It would have cost more people, maybe not the ones you'd expect, but more people. The village had already paid enough. And the original artifact being gone. Gone. The village gone. Those are real losses, and I didn't pretend otherwise. I finally looked at her. But most of them made it out alive. Most of the Thompson family made it out alive. Joseph made it out with a question about himself that he didn't have before, which is better than no question at all. I looked back at the consoles. I told them that had to count for something. They accepted it. Some did, some didn't. Reyes and Stanton found the artifact loss harder to absorb than the civilian cost, which tells you something about what some people in that room think the mission was actually for. I leaned back. Archuleta held the line. Blackwell held the other end of it. They will not have a quiet quarter when this report finalizes, and they knew that walking in. A pause. That mattered more than I wanted to admit out loud. She squeezed my hand slightly. Good. We sat with the quiet for a moment. Below us, the preserved room held its stillness, all that hardware, all that intention, all that audacity expressed in physical switches and checklist procedures, and the coffee cups of people who had drunk their coffee and then changed the world. E is still aboard Singapore. She caused quite a stir the first time maintenance personnel from Lincoln Station came on board. She looked at me. When will she be picked up by the Myri? Myri diplomatic vessel will rendezvous with us at Wolf 359. She arranged it herself, through the hive, presumably, in whatever way that communication works over that distance. I still don't fully understand the mechanism. I watched the consoles below. She came to find me before I came down here on the shuttle. Stood in the mess outside my ready room. The translator rendered what she said as approximately, observation complete, report pending, outcome undetermined. Undetermined, Nara repeated. Yeah. I thought about what that word meant. Coming from a species that could evaluate humanity's worthiness as an ally in the same breath as deciding what it wanted for breakfast. They may not trust humanity yet. The Queen hasn't made a judgment, but... A pause, because the next part carried more weight said aloud than it had in my head. They trust me. Specifically me. That's what he communicated before I left. Their trust is person-specific at this stage, not species-specific. Nara let that exist in the room without rushing to characterize it. That was the right response. I was not entirely sure whether being the specific human the Myri had decided to extend trust toward was an honor or a burden or both simultaneously, and I had not resolved it yet. The warden sent a drone. Her attention shifted in the way it did when something significant arrived. Concord wardens. Vrolksen's report apparently landed the way he said it would. I looked at her. They want me to report in. The appointment is formal. I'm going to be one of them as soon as they swear me in. The words still felt slightly foreign in my mouth. Not wrong, just new, like shoes that fit, but had not been broken in yet. Hansen, Concord Warden, Naval Captain. I'm not entirely sure how those three things coexist in practice, but I'm told there's precedent for the dual role. She took it in without rushing her reaction, which I had learned meant she was being honest rather than immediate. That's not a small thing. No, it's a very large thing that I'm trying not to think about all at once. I looked back at the control room below. Volkson's exact words in his departure assessment were that I maintain cohesion and that this is uncommon, which from him is essentially a commendation and a job description simultaneously. She almost smiled. How do you feel about it? Responsible, more responsible than I did yesterday, and yesterday was already a lot. I exhaled slowly. The wardens exist to maintain balance between species. I'm a human naval officer. Those two mandates are going to conflict at some point, and when they do, I'm going to have to figure out which one takes precedence, and I don't have a clean answer to that yet. A pause. Ask me again in a year. The room settled into something that was not conversation and was not silence, but somewhere between. The quality of shared presence that did not require either of us to say anything specifically. Gibby's already planning. That pulled a real smile. Of course he is. What? Full Cajun boil. Lafayette, Louisiana. The whole crew on the ground at the restaurant where I first met him. I leaned forward, resting my arms on my knees. He says it's non-negotiable, which means I've already agreed to it. I just haven't been informed yet. After everything, that sounds precisely right. That was my read. I thought about the crew around that table. Kimov and Bishop and Hernandez and Veros eating crawfish in a Louisiana restaurant in the middle of summer, looking slightly overwhelmed by the humidity. Fevai analyzing the nutritional profile of a bowl of gumbo with the same focus she had brought to the alien artifact. Joseph will be there too. She looked at me. He's staying in Houston. For now. He wanted to see more before making any decisions about what comes next, and Archuleta said he could stay with him. I nodded once. He's been spending time with the joint study team working on the field object. Fevai says his presence in the room changes the instrument readings, which is its own kind of extraordinary. A pause. He's 13 years old, and he already understands that his life changed permanently the moment that Plow hit something in his father's field. He's handling it better than most adults would. He had good parents. Yeah. I thought about the conversation at the field's edge, the way Abraham had stood with his hands at his sides and said it would be his choice. A man who understood what his son needed even when it cost him something. He's struggling with all of it. The technology, the scale of it, everything that was done to his community, and everything that was done for it. But he's honest about the struggle, which is more than a lot of people manage. And the object? Nara asked. The one from the field? Under joint study in the basement levels of the Coalition Science Building. Human, Lenian, Children team, Fevai is leading the Children delegation, which she clearly regards as the correct arrangement. We are going to need a new science officer. I shook my head slightly. No answers yet. The object is cooperating with Joseph's presence and completely inert for everyone else. Whatever threshold condition Veros identified in the field is holding, and nobody yet understands why a 13-year-old boy from an isolationist community on an independent world has Lenian genetic markers at functional levels. That question is going to be a long one. And Threehill. Still out there, with a Trappist database, with whatever he learned in that field about Joseph. I looked at the room below, the Apollo hardware, the preserved intention of people who had refused to accept that the distance was too far. He didn't lose. He changed the board and moved to a position we haven't fully mapped yet. When the next move comes, it won't look like the last one. A pause. Archuleta has a team working on tracking his shuttle's last known vector. So far, nothing. Nara was quiet for a moment. You're worried about Joseph specifically. Joseph is 13, and Three Hill now knows he exists, knows what he is, knows that he's here in Houston, temporarily, in a city and a context he has no experience navigating, surrounded by forces he doesn't fully understand. I looked at the consoles below, the chairs where people had once sat and guided something extraordinary through the dark to a destination nobody had reached before. I've asked Kaimov to maintain a discreet watch. Joseph doesn't know, but I'm not leaving a 13-year-old boy who represents something unprecedented in the known contact history of the species unprotected in a city while Three Heel is at large. She pressed my hand slightly. That's the right call. It's the call I'd want someone to make if it were me. We sat together for a while after that without any urgency. The preserved room below held its stillness, the consoles and coffee of people who had done extraordinary things with ordinary tools and never stopped believing the math was right. Varos is getting a proper shuttle, no more bucket of bolts. It's being assigned at Abraham Lincoln Station for use as our standard ground transport. A pause. He accepted the news with what I would characterize as restrained satisfaction, which, for Varos, is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Nara laughed, a real one, brief and genuine, the kind that arrived without being constructed. It fit the room and the mood and the weight of everything we had been sitting with, which was exactly why I had saved it. He also submitted a 14-page technical assessment of modifications he intends to make to Singapore's engineering section. None of which I fully understood, all of which Fevai says are correct. I've authorized the work to begin when we're back aboard. And Hernandez? Back to being exactly who she is. She didn't agree with every call I made, and she executed every one of them without hesitation, which is the right balance and harder to find than it sounds. I thought about the moment in the field when the sonic boom hit, and she was already moving people toward cover before I had finished processing the sound. Her sister's wedding video finally arrived while we were in orbit over Earth. She watched it in the corridor outside the Situation Room. I walked past, and she didn't say anything, just had her tablet up with the sound low, and her expression was something I don't have a word for. Nara understood what I meant, without me needing to find one. I looked down at the control room one final time. The room where people had once sat and calculated trajectories to the moon using tools that Singapore's secondary systems would have considered primitive, and had been right often enough, and careful enough, and stubborn enough to do it successfully. They had not had the right information. They had not had complete maps. They had had mathematics and the will to trust it, and the human refusal to let the size of the problem be a reason to stop. Whatever this turns into, I said quietly, it's not over. I know. Somewhere out there past Eden, past the trajectory Three Heel was running, that we could not yet track, past the joint study rooms where a field object sat cooperating with a 13-year-old boy, and nobody else, past the alien database that contained something nobody had yet been able to read. There was an intelligence that had been placing artifacts and relocating populations and apparently deciding to invest in humanity across a timeline that predated everything we understood about our own history. It had already noticed us. It had been taking notice of us for a very long time. We just had not worked out yet what it intended to do next. I squeezed Nara's hand and sat for a while longer in the quiet of the room where humanity had once learned to leave Earth, thinking about what it was going to take to be worth whatever came next. Thank you. Thank you for reading The Trappist Incident. If you enjoyed the story, leaving a short review helps other science fiction readers discover the series. Coming next, The Verdant Paradox. Concord Horizon, Book 2. Lunch on observation post Kestrel usually happened in shifts. There were too few people aboard to justify ceremony, and too many overlapping schedules to manage anything resembling normal meal hours. Scientists ate when they could. Technicians ate when reminded. The two security officers on the post's small detail ate quickly and with the permanent suspicion that something would interrupt them halfway through. Today, for a brief and increasingly rare window, enough schedules aligned that the cafeteria held a respectable crowd. All 8 of Kestrel's personnel were present at once, which Dr. Helen Marsh registered the way she registered any rare ecological event, with a small satisfaction of having been there to witness it. The room itself was practical rather than elegant. Modular tables bolted to the deck, wide observation ports along one wall, a galley line built more for efficiency than inspiration. But someone in food services had decided to try. The result was buffalo chicken macaroni and cheese. "It's aggressively American," said Dr. Yusuf Khalil from the next table, studying his tray with the suspicion of a man whose tastes ran toward Lebanese home cooking. "It's delicious," replied Dr. Marasolis without looking up from her field notes. "It's orange." "That's not a criticism." Marsh ate quietly and let them have their exchange. After 2 years aboard Kestrel, she had stopped trying to keep up with the small running arguments her colleagues maintained for the simple pleasure of arguing. The cafeteria's social ecosystem operated on rules she found easier to observe than to participate in. Beyond the observation ports, Ilari Prime turned slowly beneath them. Vast green cloud systems rolled over continents broken by winding rivers and dense equatorial forests. The planet's oceans flashed where sunlight caught them. The large moon hung pale and watchful at the limb of the horizon. Even from orbit, it looked alive in a way few worlds did. Marsh had spent 2 years cataloging why. The jungle ecosystems of the central continent operated on biochemical principles that overlapped with Earth's in ways that should not have been possible without convergent evolution running on rails. Certain compounds in the resin of one particular canopy tree species were chemically near identical to certain compounds Earth pine trees produced. Different molecular pathways, same end product, both used as defensive chemistry against insect predation. The convergence ought to have been impossible, and yet here it was, every day, in samples she could collect with her own hands when surface excursions allowed it. She had files on her workstation that no other xenobiologist in Coalition service had access to. 2 years of careful work, the kind of dataset that would define a career if it could be published, and that already had defined hers, even though most of it remained internal Coalition naval intelligence material classified above public release. Across the cafeteria, Dr. Liu, station commander, senior Coalition Navy civilian scientist, formal head of the post, was eating in his customary corner with a tablet in one hand and a fork in the other. He raised the fork in vague greeting when Marsh glanced his way. She returned the gesture. The morning's brief operational meeting had run long. They would have another one this afternoon to compensate. The pattern was familiar. The cafeteria settled into the easy rhythm of people who had lived too long in close quarters together. Cutlery against trays. Low conversation. Khalil arguing now with one of the post's 2 technicians about rainfall models over the northern continent. The other technician asleep upright with a coffee still in hand. Routine. Then the lights shifted to red. For half a second no one moved, as if the station itself needed time to explain. Then the alarm sounded. A hard, repeating pulse. Security breach. Every conversation died at once. Marsh was already on her feet when the overhead speakers activated. Alert. Unauthorized docking event. Security teams respond to junctions 3 through 6. All civilian personnel move to designated shelters immediately. "What the hell?" Solis said. No one answered. The far bulkhead screen came alive with a camera feed from one of the docking corridors. Smoke. Then movement through it. Tall figures in matte armor advancing with practiced discipline. Kalar. Marsh had seen Kalar in briefing files and diplomatic footage, but never in person. Larger than baseline humans, built dense and broad through shoulder and chest, their movement economical in a way that suggested expensive training and a willingness to use it. 4 of them on the screen. Then someone stepped through behind them. No helmet, no hurry. The figure was unusually large even for a Kellar. Marsh's mind supplied the name from the security briefing's Coalition Navy intelligence, circulated to all sensitive postings. 3-heel. The rogue actor whose face every Coalition outpost commander had been told to memorize since the Trappist Incident 3 months ago. The one who had escaped with the Trappist artifact. Even on grainy security footage, he carried himself with the calm of someone who had already accounted for every variable worth considering. Solis swore under her breath. "Why would he be here?" Khalil asked. Again, no one answered. The feed cut to static. The station shuddered once, distant, controlled. Not an explosion, a breach charge. "Move!" Lou's voice from his corner, no longer the calm administrator. "Shelter protocols, now!" People finally did. Trays clattered, chairs overturned. The cafeteria emptied into practiced evacuation routes. The post's personnel flowing toward internal shelter compartments drilled into them often enough that fear could run on top of instinct without replacing it. Marsh did not move toward shelter. She moved toward Lou instead, catching him as he was about to follow the others into the corridor. "My workstation," she said. 2 years of biological field data. Most of it isn't mirrored. He looked at her for half a second. He was station commander. He could order her to shelter, and she would have to comply. He was also a working scientist who understood exactly what she was about to lose if she did not act in the next 60 seconds. "Go," he said. "Fast, I'll hold the shelter door for you." She went. The corridor outside data operations smelled faintly of ozone. Marsh reached the hatch and slipped through. Rows of server stacks hummed under emergency lighting. Consoles glowed amber, where systems had dropped to isolated mode. She sat hard at the nearest terminal and keyed in credentials. The system responded with the deliberate slowness of equipment running on backup power. She forced herself to breathe while it processed her authentication. Her personal directory came up. 2 years of work scrolled past in folder names she had organized by ecological domain, canopy biochemistry, riverine ecology, soil microbiome surveys, herpetological surveys, comparative chemistry, and folded into the biological work because her field methodology required understanding the Ilari people whose territory she had been studying alongside the ecosystem. Her informal anthropological compilation. 2 years of careful observation of Ilari religious practice, priesthood structure, ceremonial calendar, the specific rituals she had witnessed during her sanctioned surface excursions. The anthropology was not officially her work. It belonged to Solis by departmental assignment. But Marsh had been keeping her own version because no field biologist could properly study an ecosystem without understanding the cultural practices of the people who lived within it. The Ilari priesthood managed the sacred groves where some of her most important plant specimens grew. She had needed to understand them to know which trees she was permitted to sample and which trees she could only observe from distance. She initiated an encrypted transfer of her entire personal directory to the post's secure cache, the segregated backup system designed for exactly this kind of contingency, with its own isolated power supply and independent cryptographic protocols. The cache existed precisely because Coalition Navy intelligence understood that observation posts on the edge of known space might at some point need to preserve their most important work against the possibility that the post itself could be lost. The transfer initiated. She watched the progress bar with the slow agony of someone who understood exactly how much depended on the next 90 seconds. A scuffle in the corridor. Voices. Urgent. Then nothing. 43%. She forced herself to keep watching the progress bar rather than the door. There was nothing she could do about the door. The transfer either completed or it did not. 68%. She heard footsteps now. Heavy, deliberate, not running, coming closer. 81%. The door to data operations opened. 2 of the Kalar mercenaries stood there with weapons leveled. Marsh raised her hands slowly and stayed seated at the terminal. The progress bar continued its slow march. 92%. One of the Kalar spoke into a communications device in his own language. Marsh's translator picked up fragments. A request for instructions, an acknowledgement. Something about the terminal she was at. 96%. The other Kalar gestured for her to stand. She did, hands still raised, and stepped back from the terminal as he indicated. The progress bar hit 100% as she moved. The transfer completed. The cache acknowledged receipt. The work was saved. The Kalar moved past her to the terminal and began a methodical extraction of the data still on it. He did not delete her personal directory. He copied it first. Then he moved to the post-central scientific archives and copied those. Then geological surveys. Then atmospheric records. Then, and here, Marsh's chest tightened, because she understood the pattern: anthropological compilations, cultural progression indexes, comparative development projections, every file the post held on the Ilari civilization and on the geological structure in the central mountain range that Liu's team had been studying without ever quite understanding what they were looking at. The Kalar finished his copy operation and began selective deletion of originals. Not everything. Specific files. Targeted threads. He worked for perhaps 15 minutes while the other one held Marsh at gunpoint. Neither of them spoke to her. Neither of them spoke to each other beyond brief communications device acknowledgments. They worked with the calm efficiency of people who had done this kind of operation many times, and who expected to do it many more. When they were done, the second Kalar gestured for Marsh to walk ahead of him. She walked. He directed her through the corridors toward the post-secondary briefing room, a space without windows, with a single reinforced door, designed for sensitive conversations but apparently being repurposed for prisoner containment. Liu was already inside, along with Khalil, Solis, the technician, and the security officer. All 6 of the others were alive. Some were injured. Solis had blood on her temple. One of the security officers had a wound to his upper arm that someone had already bandaged with field medical efficiency. The Kalar pushed Marsh through the door. The door sealed behind her. She stood in the dim emergency lighting and counted. 7 of them, including herself. All 6 of the post's other personnel. Everyone accounted for. Nobody killed. Liu looked at her. He did not ask whether she had succeeded. He simply nodded once, recognizing the answer in her face. The post shuddered, distant and controlled. The hostile craft was undocking. Through the bulkhead they could feel the small mechanical adjustments of an assault shuttle releasing its grapples and pulling clear. Then silence. Marsh sat down against the wall. She had saved what she could save. The cache held the work of 2 years. Whatever Three-Heel had taken, whatever he had purged from the central archives, her personal directory was preserved in the segregated system that no Kalar mercenary would have known existed. The Ilari Religious Anthropology, informal, unauthorized, compiled because she had needed it to do her actual job, was intact. Whoever came to recover the post would find her work waiting for them. In the dim of the locked space, with Lou and the others arranging themselves into the patient endurance of people who would now wait days for rescue, Marsh closed her eyes and began the cold calculation of what Three-Heel had taken and what he intended to do with it. The Ilari geological surveys, the Ilari religious mapping, comparative development data on the central continent's mountain range. The pattern was clear enough once she made herself look at it. He was going to the surface. He had not come to destroy the outpost. He had come for information, and whatever he had found was important enough to risk coming here in person. The emergency was over. The problem had only just begun. Pre-order the Verdant Paradox now. About the author. R.M. Stratton writes intelligent, character-driven science fiction that blends first-contact mystery, military strategy, and the human side of leadership under pressure. His work focuses on the people inside large events, captains making impossible decisions, crews bound by loyalty, and civilizations confronting discoveries that challenge everything they thought they knew. He is the creator of the Concord Horizon series, beginning with the Trappist Incident, an expansive universe of hidden history, interstellar politics, and exploration at the edge of the unknown. Stratton draws inspiration from classic science fiction, naval history, world cultures, and the timeless question of how humanity changes or fails to change when it reaches the stars. This has been part 4 of R.M. Stratton's The Trappist Incident Book 1 in his military science fiction series Concord Horizon. If you've enjoyed the audiobook, the link to the ebook available on Amazon is in the description.